Chapter 995. When Sword Immortal In Sheng appeared, Master Yun and the other immortals stopped in their tracks. They stood on the cliff and looked over. He was one of the strongest cocoon breakers, and also one of the juniors that the Aoyama Grandmaster relied on the most. But the immortals of the previous generation did not move, not because of his pride and power, but because of his identity. He was the founder of the No Mercy sect. Peng Lang was a disciple of the No Mercy sect. Peng Lang carried his sword as a shackle and bowed his head to In Sheng. Was he lowering his head to the patriarch? Seeing this, the immortals of the previous generation felt their hearts grow heavier. Lowering his head was not a sign of submission, but an apology. This meant that even if he was facing his own sect's ancestral master, he would still continue up the mountain. After reading the book written by Jing Jiao, I learned that so many things have happened in the sect over the years. Longevity Mountain's resurgence is thanks to you. The immortal of Sword In Sheng said to Peng Lang, "I'm grateful to you, and I admire you very much. But I'm indebted to the founding master, and the No Mercy sect is indebted to him." The origin of the No Mercy sect was that heaven and earth didn't favor humans, but humans did favor humans. Of course, the most important thing is that I think what Patriarch did was right, In Sheng said. Peng Lang said seriously, "I understand." In Sheng said, "Come on." Peng Lang said, "Grandmaster, please advise me." In Sheng grunted, turned around, and walked into the distance. His black Taoist robe fluttered, and he soon arrived several kilometers away. He untied his sword and threw it into the hard cliff wall. Then he sat cross-legged and closed his eyes. Since Peng Lang could not use a sword, he naturally could not use one either. The wind blew the dust on the ground, hitting the cliff wall and then slowly drifting back. Peng Lang looked into the distance and slowly sat down before closing his eyes. Countless sword intents rose majestically between the cliffs. The expressions of Master Yun and the other immortals who were watching the battle from afar changed slightly, and they fled to the top of the mountain as fast as they could. Chunya looked at the countless sword wheels in the air and remained silent. No one knew what he was thinking. Behind him, the guys surrounding the tattered robot didn't seem to be seriously injured at all, and they kept talking. Shin Yunmai had given up the idea of detonating the nuclear power furnace and perishing together with Chunya, and so had Tong Yin. It was the same feeling that Su Zai had when he saw Peng Lang fly into the great formation of the solar system with the dead dog. They knew that Peng Lang was strong, but they didn't expect him to be this strong. Who do you think will win? I'm afraid that Peng Lang is already an arrow at the end of its flight, and both of them practice the sword work of the No Mercy sect. I'm afraid that this fight will be dangerous. Enshing abandoned his sword, handsome, as expected of someone I admire. Not bad. This time, Peng Lang's chances of winning are even greater. How are they going to fight this round? Can't you see that the world is filled with sword intent? Shin Yunmai, Kane Yang, and even Yuan Chu and Yushan all let out cries of surprise. Tong Yan's eyebrows, which had just become lighter, grew thicker again, knitted tightly. It was not difficult for Enshing and Peng Lang to fill heaven and earth with sword wills when they had practiced the sword work, but it was evidently not so easy at the moment. The rocks on the cliff walls, the objects in the old human buildings covered with a thin layer of dust in the distance, and the sparse, dry ice clouds in the sky were all changing along with the sword wills. The rocks on the cliff walls were rolling around, aiming at the distance with their sharp edges. The dry ice clouds were pulled into a thin thread like a sword string. The devices in the human buildings were the same. They had seen a similar scene, so they knew what it meant. How come that person knows the all-in-one? Yuan Chu exclaimed in surprise. Su Zai said feebly, "How come the extreme sword work of the Aoyama sect is so widespread in this world?" Shin Yunmai sneered. "He is a junior that the old guy admires. It's not a big deal for him to teach him a few moves in private. It sounds like Jing Jiao hasn't taught him anything." That's right. Senior Master taught Peng Lang at the 3000 nunnery many years ago, Yushan said while nodding forcefully. He can definitely do it. The founder of the No Mercy sect and the master of the No Mercy sect were going to use the sword work of the Aoyama sect to compete with each other. It sounded absurd, but it was understandable considering the complicated relationship between the No Mercy sect and the Aoyama sect. The Master Yun, the immortal Wuan, and the other immortals landed by the cliff's edge, looking at the distance together with Chunya. The sword wills pervading heaven and earth grew more and more formidable, even triggering a reaction from the sword formation in the solar system. The dim light projected from the universe to Mars was refracted and twisted by the seemingly tangible sword wills. The distant sun and the ancestral planet had gradually disappeared. This was the ultimate sword work of the Aoyama sect. How powerful would it be when two extremely powerful swordsmen wielded it at the same time? It was well known that the battle between Jian Shilai and generally in the galaxy beyond the fog had destroyed the asteroid belt. Seeing the situation, the expressions on the faces of the immortals grew even more grave. The Master Yin waved his horsetail whisk lightly, sending down hundreds of white clouds to protect the top of the mountain, including Tong Yin and the others. The huge sword in the chest of the immortal Wuan suddenly buzzed like a bell. "It's not right," he said solemnly. The voice of Shun Yunmai drifted over from behind the cliff. "It's over." In terms of the sword work of the Aoyama sect, Shun Yunmai was definitely the one with the highest attainment among the people on the cliff. His judgment would never be wrong. Yet, the sword wills were still drifting on the desolate surface of Mars. How could it be over? Guzwa reached out his right hand, and Guyu reached out his left hand. The two brothers formed a circle with their hands, aiming at a spot at the bottom of the cliff that couldn't be seen. A blurry image gradually appeared between the two hands. The surprise screams broke out in the cliff. Somewhere at the bottom of the cliff. Normally, this place should be darker, but it was extremely bright at the moment. It was because of the fire. It was the burning fairy blood. The fairy swordsman, In Sheng, sat on the same spot with his legs crossed. The mechanical arm was 100 feet away, the golden blood gushing out from the broken shoulder. The golden blood started to burn when it came into contact with the thin air, and it burned when it came into contact with the pebbles. If there were only these flames, they could only illuminate the cliff walls. But it seemed that even the sky was illuminated, which meant there were more flames. Peng Lang stood in front of In Sheng, holding the sword in his right hand and pointing it at the spot between In Sheng's eyebrows. This was the first time he wielded his sword today. In the previous fight, his sword had been bound by the green light rope of the Grandmaster of Aoyama. Why was it freed now? He had cut off the green light rope with his ordinary sword. It was not an easy task to cut it off, not to mention that the green light rope had coiled around his neck twice. He had paid a great price for cutting off the green light rope. It was the deep wound on his neck. The golden blood gushed out from the wound like a waterfall and turned into a golden flame, illuminating the sky and the earth. Amidst the golden flame, Peng Lang's ordinary face looked so sacred. The ending of this sword fight was too tragic. As a matter of fact, the beginning of this sword fight was tragic. When the fairy swordsman In Sheng used the all-in-one sword way to turn everything on Mars into his sword, Peng Lang didn't do anything. All he did was turn his right hand around and hack at the green light rope. It looked like he was committing suicide by cutting his own throat. If he had been careless, he might have died by his own sword. He was severely wounded, but he didn't die. He held his sword again and walked toward In Sheng. It was like that year when the No Mercy sect sealed off the mountain and all the masters and colleagues were cultivating behind closed doors. He was the only one awake. He practiced the introductory sword script tirelessly while holding his sword. When Emperor Shao came to the front of the Grand Hall with the autumn leaf, he walked over while holding his sword and stabbed that famous hidden swordsman to death. Today, he walked to the front of In Sheng and hacked at him with his sword, cutting off one of the arms of the Grandmaster of his sect. "I didn't expect you to use my all-in-one sword way to hack it yourself, successfully breaking the sword rope of the Grandmaster." In Sheng continued while looking at him. "I didn't expect you to be so violent and reckless, even though you look calm." Peng Lang explained earnestly. Back at the 3000 nunnery, The immortal told me that the duty of the sword is to come out of the sheath, no matter who tries to stop it, including the masters of heaven and earth, or even the sword's own sheath. Many people in Chaotian have been guessing for many years what Jingjiu had taught this young man when he and Peng Lang stayed in the nunnery for one night. It turned out to be the nature of the sword. The sword had to come out of the sheath. Otherwise, it would be no different from a fire stick. The bleeding had gradually stopped. The fire grew dimmer as well. Looking at this young man who had regained his composure and was even a bit slow, the fairy swordsman, In Sheng, said contentedly, "You've won." He was pleased that this young man was more powerful than him. And he was even more pleased that this young man had created the true meaning of the sword work. Peng Lang was a disciple of the No Mercy sect, so the true meaning of the sword work he created was the sword work of the No Mercy sect. It was not the sword work of the Aoyama sect. Peng Lang didn't know how to respond. "Outstanding," the fairy swordsman In Sheng praised. Peng Lang felt a bit embarrassed, so he changed the topic hastily, asking, "Grandmaster, are you all right?" In Sheng looked at him expressionlessly. The mechanical arm on the ground in the distance gave him the middle finger. Peng Lang scratched his head. "Let's go," In Sheng said. "Okay," Peng Lang replied honestly. In Sheng instructed, "Surrender if you can't win." "I can't," Peng Lang said earnestly. Feeling surprised, In Sheng asked, "Based on your mental fortitude, didn't you fight the new queen in Chaotian?" Peng Lang said embarrassedly, "Grandmaster, that's a family matter." Before In Sheng could react, he turned around and leapt up into the air, heading to the top of the mountain. Peng Lang's feet landed on the ground. Then his body swayed a bit. Regardless of whether he landed with a thud or stood unsteadily, it was evident that he was on the verge of dying. The injuries of the others weren't any less severe than his. Even if Tong Yin could do something, it would be meaningless. At the moment, the Grandmaster, the fairy maiden He, and the fairy swordsman In Sheng were severely wounded. Including the 2 wounded by Tong Yin earlier, there were at least 8 fairy maidens here. Seeing Peng Lang on the verge of losing his balance with his sword in his hand, the fairy maidens showed a respectful expression in their eyes, but they didn't rush forward. After all, they weren't the queen. "Young friend, why don't you stop fighting? We just don't want you to ruin the Grandmaster's plan. When the plan is over, I'll let you go at the risk of my life," Master Yin said gently. Looking at this fairy maiden with a faint fairy aura and a light-colored robe, Tong Yin asked, "Are you Master Yin?" Master Yin said with a smile, "I didn't expect a junior in Chaotian to still remember me." Tong Yin said, "Back when you were cultivating outside Ozawa, you killed many evil dragons. The populace still remembers you." "It's all in the past," Master Yin said sentimentally. Chunya suddenly said expressionlessly, "I know you're very smart and want to do something, but do you really think we, the seniors, will be fooled by your words?" Hearing this, Tong Yin fell silent and patted the robot by her side. Shun Yunmai exclaimed angrily, "They have all been fooled by the old man. What can I do?" Seeing that the defeat was irreversible, people like Tong Yin and Shun Yunmai had to come up with some sinister methods. The simplest method was to provoke the fairy maidens of the previous generations to fight against each other. "Well," Peng Lang said embarrassedly, "I haven't finished fighting yet." Suzai inhaled deeply and exclaimed, "You can still fight?" Peng Lang said to Chunya, "You sneak attacked me earlier. I want to fight back." Chunya looked at him expressionlessly and said, "You're indeed a rare genius in the sword work. Are you sure you want to die on this barren planet?" As he said this, he reached out his hand toward the outside of the cliff. It was soundless. 2 broken green ropes of light tore through the air and wrapped around his wrists. By now, everybody knew that this green light rope was a magic treasure made by the Grandmasters of Aoyama, but they didn't expect that it could still be used after being broken in half. The expression on Peng Lang's face grew more serious. He raised his sword and said, "Please, we both use swords. Let me do it." All of a sudden, a voice burst out on the cliff. The immortal woman walked back from the edge of the cliff unsteadily while holding the huge sword. heading toward Penglang. Like the Master Yun, this immortal Wuan was a famous ascendant in Chaotian. He was most famous for slaying the Southern Oriole with a sword. The Southern Oriole had the bloodline of a divine animal from ancient times. Though it was not as pure as the bloodline of the unicorn and the old dragon, it was as ferocious. Back when the Southern Oriole was invincible in the south, countless humans of the barbaric tribes died tragically under its wings. Upon hearing this, the immortal Wuan rode his sword and flew away from Shiwu Mountain, slaying the Southern Oriole as the morning sun rose. If one didn't count the old dragon killed by the king of the underworld, this Southern Oriole was the divine animal from ancient times who died in the hands of the cultivation practitioners. He was absolutely qualified to fight against Penglang. The wind in the cliff began to drift along with the footsteps of the immortal Wuan. The sand and gravel rustled slightly. The atmosphere on Mars was thin, and the wind was very weak. The wind and the sand and gravel were all caused by the sword wills he exuded. The immortal Wuan adjusted his sword wills to the maximum within a few steps. He was still 100 feet away from Penglang. He happened to pass by Chunya. The huge sword suddenly struck down, and it headed toward Chunya. This sword strike was truly formidable. It carried a great amount of fairy energy, and it carried a great deal of lethal intent. If Chunya were unprepared, he would definitely die under this sword strike. There was a loud bang. Chunya had raised his right hand and turned it into a stone shield, blocking the huge sword. Crack! A crack appeared on the surface of the stone shield, and so did a crack in Chunya's eyes. The immortal Wuan remained silent. The fairy energy in his body kept pouring into the huge sword he held with both hands, and he kept attacking the stone shield. There was another loud bang, and the stone shield suddenly shattered. The immortal Wuan was knocked back, and he spat out a mouthful of fairy blood. He stabbed the huge sword into the ground to stabilize himself. Chunya's injuries were much more severe than his. His face was full of cracks like spider webs, and he looked extremely horrifying. He stared at the immortal Wuan and asked, "Why do you want to kill me?" This was the answer that everyone present wanted to know. Tong Yin and Shun Yin might didn't know either. Their plan to sow discord between the immortal Wuan and the immortal Wuan was useless. Why did the immortal Wuan suddenly betray them? Then why are you guarding against me? The immortal Wuan asked expressionlessly as he looked at Chunya. Why did Chunya guard against him in secret? Could it be that he knew the immortal Wuan would launch a sneak attack on him? After a moment of silence, Chunya asked, "Are you doing this with elixir?" "That's right," the immortal Wuan said expressionlessly. "When we were on that shabby pirate ship, I told you the story of traveling with him on planet Tianpu because I wanted to test you." After a moment of silence, Chunya said, "Just as I expected." The immortals had sensed something amiss from the conversation, and they were all astonished. Master Yin looked at Chunya and asked in a deep voice, "Where is Master Dan?" "He should be dead by now." The immortal Wuan smiled as if he was about to cry. He looked at the two demon immortals in black and asked, "Did you kill him?" Guyu remained silent. Gu's was said apologetically, "It was an accident. Nobody expected that he would commit suicide all of a sudden. We didn't want that to happen either." The immortal Wuan's body swayed slightly, and he said with a cold smile, "But he is still dead. Who did you say died?" The ground on the cliff quaked slightly, and a crack appeared. The fairy nun broke out from the ground and asked while staring at him. Her face was pale, not only because of the injuries inflicted on her by Penglang, but also because of the shock brought by the news. Master Yun and the other immortals were also astonished, asking one after another, "What is going on?" The cultivation practitioners in the heavenly arrival state could live for more than 1,000 years, not to mention the immortals who had successfully ascended. As long as there was enough fairy energy in the universe, they could live for tens of thousands of years. Though nobody had lived for such a long time, they regarded life and death as something more important than mortals. In other words, they didn't care about the lives and deaths of mortals, but they did care about the lives of the immortals like them. As the immortals questioned him in astonishment, nobody noticed that Tong Yin, who was leaning against the robot, had suddenly closed his eyes. He was recalling something with his eyes closed. In the electronic maintenance shop on the Stargate base. The young girl on planet Tianpu. He even recalled that internet cafe. The death of Master Dan was, of course, related to him. He opened his eyes and looked at Chunya, his expression calm and cold. Chapter 996. When I killed that southern Oriole, I didn't ask why it did such evil things, nor did I ask if I had the ability to do so. When I followed the patriarch to kill those mother nests in the Sea of Darkness, I didn't ask these questions either. That's because, to me, things like reason are very simple. There's no need to ask for the answer. Taoist Wen raised his heavy sword and pointed it at Chunya. But I want to ask today, why? Master Yun, Lady Celestial, and the other immortals all looked at Chunya. They also wanted to know the answer. Because he betrayed the patriarch. He told these guys the location of the Shun family mansion and the ancestral planet. Chunya looked at Tong Yin and said, "It should be you, right?" Tong Yin should deny it now, so that Taoist Wu's anger would burn even more fiercely, and a rift would really appear between the immortals of the previous generation. However, he did not say anything. He silently admitted it. And then, he deserved to die. Patriarch, and all of you can let a guy like Chi Song live, but you can't let him live? Taoist Wen said sadly, ascending to the Tao, breaking out of the cocoon to become an immortal and fighting for the peace of mankind. It sounds nice, but what have we done all these years? Jingjiu was right in the galaxy beyond the fog. We are just a bunch of dogs. No, we're the same, Chunya said in a deep voice. Same, but I don't agree with your Tao now. Taoist Wen said seriously. He held the sword with both hands and slashed. The sword intent on the surface of Mars disappeared with Enshung's serious injury. The light from the universe shone on the surface of Mars again, condensing into an even bigger sword behind Taoist Wen. The sword stretched across the sky and slashed at Chunya with unimaginable power. Crack! Amidst the terrifying cracking sound, the extremely sturdy stone shield suddenly cracked. Chunya's face turned abnormally red, and he tossed the green rope in his hand into the sky. Black and white light appeared on the cliff. The two demon immortals in black stood thousands of feet apart. They linked their hands in the air, forming a slowly flowing cyclone. They temporarily slowed down the falling speed of the sword. Tong Yan's expression changed slightly at the sight of this. There was a cracking sound. A green rope of light flew 300 meters into the sky and disappeared without a trace. Suddenly, countless bright sword lights appeared in the dark space. They combined into lightning-like objects and struck toward the cliff. The lightning-like sword lights were exceedingly bright and carried an unimaginable power, similar to the heavenly punishment in Chaotian. Could this be the power of the sword array that spanned across the solar system? Taoist Wen let out a long roar. He showed no fear as he held the huge sword with both hands and continued to slash forward. Following two light popping sounds, the cyclone formed by the black and white rays was cut down by the sword edge. The two demon immortals in black robes withdrew their attacks. The light rays condensed into an even larger sword edge directly cut through the sky, heading towards the group of lightning falling from space. Not even a wisp of green smoke could be seen. The lightning suddenly disappeared, and so did the giant sword. Taoist Tao Seeker stood there in silence. He slowly put down the sword in his hand. His face was filled with sorrow and disappointment. Then he closed his eyes. Crack, crack, crack. At least 10,000 tiny cracking sounds came out from his body. At the same time, more than 10,000 tiny sword lights appeared. His clothes were torn to shreds, and so was the huge sword. Then, the fairy body of Taoist Wen turned into dust after being brushed by the gentle wind on the cliff top. The wind continued blowing gently, mixing the dust into the gravel on the ground or into the abyss at the bottom of the cliff. It was unclear how many years it would take for the dust to drift on Mars. It was deathly quiet on the cliff. Everybody was shocked, speechless. Had Taoist Wen died, just like that? Chunya couldn't be this powerful. no matter how powerful he was. The key was the 2 green ropes of light. They were the magic treasures personally crafted by the Grandmasters of Aoyama, and they had a deep connection with the sword array that spanned across the solar system. Chunya had used the 2 green ropes of light to induce the sword wheels in the formation to descend. Of course, the most important reason was the arrogance of Taoist Wuan. It was the arrogance of a ferryman, and it was the arrogance of a swordsman. Even though he knew that the lightning bolts descending from the space were the great sword array set up by the Grandmasters of Aoyama over 100 years, he still had no intention of retreating and chose to fight head-on. Then, he was slashed into dust by the sword array. The sound of a bell suddenly rang out on the deathly, silent mountaintop. Was it the sound of the death knell? No, the sound of the bell came from Tong Yan's palm. He didn't expect Taoist Wuan to attack Chunya with his sword, and he didn't expect Taoist Wuan to fight head-on against the sword array of the Grandmasters of Aoyama. As such, he couldn't prevent it from happening. Since it had already happened, he should fight to the end. His fairy energy was almost depleted after fighting with the 3 fairy men in the valley, and he hadn't recovered much of it yet, but he still wanted to give it a try. Many years ago, the immortal Tan had rung the bell in the royal palace of Zhaoga City, and then the bell traveled back and forth between heaven and earth. It was the ultimate technique of the escape method of heaven and earth at Zhongzhou School. It was the same today. Along with the sound of the bell, Tong Yin disappeared from the side of the robot. In the next moment, he appeared in front of Chunya. The devil man in black, the other ferrymen, and even Chunya himself didn't have any reaction. Tong Yan's palm landed on Chunya's abdomen. His eyes and brows were much younger than those of the same age, and his palm was smaller than those of the same age, looking rather delicate. Chunya had turned into a large mountain that day and descended from the sky, and then he had used a great deal of his fairy energy to attack Peng Lang. His left arm had been chopped off by the huge sword of Taoist Wuan, and it seemed that he had no more power to fight. However, the body of the stone man of Chun Wu was the real weapon, and its firmness was only inferior to the golden body of the Zen sections. What could such a delicate palm do? Everybody knew that it was an unwise choice to fight head-on with the stone man of Chun Wu. Tong Yin was extremely intelligent. Why would he do such a thing when he had finally found an opportunity to sneak attack? No one expected an extremely clear and loud sound to suddenly burst out from a cliff. The sound came from the place where Chunya's abdomen and Tong Yan's palm came into contact. It was like the hardest sword had been broken, the heaviest cauldron had been broken, and the most brittle glass had been shattered. A crack extended out from that place, like the trace of lightning in the night sky, or the first thread of a spider web. Rubble fell from the crack, and it moved towards the depths at a speed visible to the naked eye. The defense of Chun Wu Mountain Stone Golem was actually broken by this simple palm strike. How was this possible? The crowd was astonished. The 2 devil immortals in black attacked as quickly as they could. 2 cold energies formed a line and appeared between Tong Yin and Chunya from a long distance away. At the same time, dozens of pure white cloud threads appeared from the void and wrapped around Chunya's shattering abdomen, repelling Tong Yan's palm. Those silvery and jade-like cloud threads continued moving upward and formed a cloudy umbrella above Chunya, blocking the sky and ensuring that Tong Yin couldn't continue his attack even if he had the strength to spare. It was evident that this was Master Yun's doing. Almost at the same time, 2 more immortals wielded their own magic treasures and shot them toward Tong Yin. The Tao immortal between the 2 devil immortals in black pulled over a dozen black lightning bolts from the void, illuminating the gloomy cliff rocks and then blackening them. Chunya was in a critical situation. The immortals exerted their full strength to save him without hesitation. A black lightning bolt landed on Tong Yan's foot. The light emitted by the magic treasure illuminated his pale face. He retreated swiftly, treading in the air like the wind in the pine forest. He evaded those attacks and returned to the side of the robot. Su Zai had prepared the only ancient magic pill of the Kunlun sect. He stuffed it into Tong Yan's mouth. The magic pill melted as soon as it entered Tong Yan's mouth, turning into a light ray that washed his entire body like clear water, expelling the remaining power of the black lightning bolt from Tong Yan's body. His face pale, Tong Yan coughed twice. A few drops of blood seeped out from the corners of his mouth and ignited in the wind, disappearing instantly as if he had spat out a few pieces of gold. What a pity, he thought silently in his heart. He knew he had missed the best opportunity to kill Chunya. Even if Shun Yunmai took out the nuclear furnace from the earring and detonated it, it would be difficult for them to perish together. In the end, all the people on his side would be killed. He felt it was a pity that he couldn't kill Chunya. The others, including Kane Yang, Yuan Chu, and Yushan, were all stunned, their eyes full of awe as they looked at him. Though he was severely wounded, he still managed to sneak attack Chunya while surrounded by so many immortals and almost killed him. The front part of Chunya's robe was torn to shreds, exposing his rock-hard body, which had many cracks on it. The deepest cracks had penetrated deep into his body, and a leaden object could be vaguely seen. Though it was unclear what it was, it should be the source of Chunya's magic methods. If Master Yin hadn't restrained it with the cloud threads, the cracks would have grown wider. Chunya pulled back his gaze and looked at Tong Yin in the distance, asking earnestly, "How did you do it?" "I'm good at digging holes," replied Tong Yin. He had dug holes for many years at the bottom of Cloud Dream Mountain, and he had dug holes on the West Island for a long time. Speaking of the person in Chaotian who was the best at digging holes, he should be the one. No matter how hard the rock was, he could figure out the material and the direction of the lines of the rock as soon as he glanced at it, as well as what magic method he should employ to break it in the shortest time. Though the stone man on Chinwu Mountain had a very strong defense, he was merely a cliff rock in his eyes. "Kill him." Chunya waved his remaining right arm tiredly, motioning for the two devil immortals in black to ignore him. The black lightning bolts struck down more frequently. The shapeless chains of devil energy between the two devil immortals in black exuded a gloomy and cold energy, trapping Tong Yin in the middle. Peng Lang raised the curved sword in his hand slowly and aimed it at Chunya, as if he was lifting a crossbow. The two immortals stood in front of Chunya. A look of pity surfaced on Yun Shi's face, and he tried to persuade Zhang Xian against it. Chunya didn't give him the chance to speak. He threw the last half of the green light rope into the sky. It didn't need to fly too high. All it needed was to fly 300 meters to enter the great formation across the solar system. Countless sword lights came down from the sky like bright lightning bolts, striking down from the sky toward Peng Lang. The green light rope had restrained Peng Lang's sword, and then it was cut open by him. He should be able to dodge the sword wills from the universe as long as he didn't fight them head-on like Immortal Wuan did. The problem was if he dodged them, the lightning bolts would fall on Tong Yin and the people beside the robot. Peng Lang looked at the lightning bolts falling from the sky with a serious expression. His posture of holding the sword changed slightly. He bent his left knee slightly, as if he would jump up at any moment. All of a sudden, two bolts of lightning appeared in the dark sky. These two bolts of lightning were brighter and straighter than the lightning bolts falling from the sword formation of the solar system. They were two sword lights. The sword lights came out of nowhere and flew into the lightning bolts. Countless sword sounds rang out at the same time. Kane Yang and the others couldn't help but cover their ears. Master Yun's horsetail whisk broke into pieces. Swish, 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 swish. The terrifying lightning bolts were shattered by the two sword lights. Another figure arrived along with the sword lights. The figure glowed with a golden light against the dark universe, looking extremely dazzling. The figure flew down and punched toward the cliff. The umbrella-like cloud was shattered by his fist. It only stopped for a moment before it reached the top of Chunya's head. Chunya sensed extreme danger. He let out a deep roar and gathered all the remaining immortal aura in his body. Then, he punched upward through his remaining right arm. Boom! The figure's fist met Chunya's palm. Chunya's clothes were torn to shreds. His body was covered with a thick layer of rocks that emitted a faint green glow. The figure's golden glow became even more intense. An unimaginable amount of immortal aura and the glow of magic treasures illuminated the cliff. An unimaginably loud boom burst out between the fist and the palm. The sword sounds reverberating on the surface of Mars were crushed by the loud boom, like reeds being blown away by a hurricane. The terrifying shock wave swept through the gravel, punching countless small holes in the cliff rocks and riddling the robot with holes. The two immortals closest to Chun Ya could only use their magic treasures to protect their bodies. They were sent flying down the cliff before they could do anything. The ground shook violently and collapsed. The cliff rocks kept compressing and sinking downward. The mountain was about to collapse. Would Chunya be able to withstand such power? The two black-robed demon immortals could not be bothered with Tong Yin and Peng Lang. They quickly formed hand seals and controlled dozens of black lightning bolts to slash at the golden figure. However, the black lightning bolts filled with demonic aura did not even get close to the battlefield. They suddenly disappeared into a series of illusions. In the smoke that filled the sky, one could vaguely see souls flashing at the edges of the illusions. They emitted an evilness that was even deeper and darker than the black lightning bolts. Enough! An extremely complicated voice rang out in the sky. Sage Tsingju had arrived at the cliff. He waved the paper fan in his hand and flashed away the soul flames emitted by the banners. The golden light in the sky also dimmed slightly. That person left Chunya's head and landed in front of Tong Yin as gently as a bird. The golden light gradually disappeared into his body, revealing the person's true appearance. He was a middle-aged man with a slightly dark complexion. His appearance was ordinary, but he looked amiable and trustworthy. His checkered shirt had been burned to ashes a long time ago. He was holding the seal of the king of the underworld in his right hand, which was missing a corner. It should have been damaged by the previous collision. The 10,000-soul banner, exuding a cold and gloomy energy, was fluttering behind him, disappearing and reappearing from time to time. The lone sword and the first child sword were moving around his body, leaving two arcs as fast as lightning. Lu Shi Sui. Chunya mumbled while looking at that person. His voice was still stiff and cold, but at this time, it had an extremely hoarse feeling, as if his voice had broken along with his vocal cords. After saying this, the remaining 2 fingers on his right hand let out a crisp crack and fell off. Soon after, his arms fell to the ground and were smashed into powder. This stone man from Mount Shenwu was sneak attacked by Tong Yin and then attacked by Lu Shi Sui. He couldn't stand it any longer. He was crushed. It was both a spiritual and a material one. Cracks appeared on his feet and scattered into gravel. Then his calves, then his thighs, then his waist. The cracking didn't stop until it reached his chest. He fell to the ground and turned into a half-body statue that was commonly seen. It looked as if he had been blown by the wind and sand for tens of thousands of years. He looked very old. Chapter 997. After an unknown amount of time, the descending mountain peak finally stopped. If someone looked at the surface of Mars from outer space, they would be able to see the change clearly. Could this highest mountain in the solar system still maintain its position? This was the power of a life-and-death battle between the immortals, and most of the power was borne by them. Only a small part of it leaked out to the world. The black lightning reappeared on the cliff. Seeing Chunya's miserable condition, the 2 immortals in black couldn't control themselves anymore and launched another attack. Lu Shi Sui didn't move. The banner didn't move either. The first child sword and the lone sword flew over soundlessly toward those black lightning bolts, cutting them into pieces instantly. Crack! Crack! The 2 immortals in black let out a muffled groan as the life-saving demonic weapons tied to their waists shattered into something like crystal powder, and blood oozed out from their clothes. The 2 immortals who had been knocked off the cliff flew back. The immortal sword, In Sheng, also returned to the cliff with his mechanical arm, and the Godslayer Master who still had his eyes closed. They looked at the situation on the cliff in great shock. In Sheng walked to the front of Chunya and said after a moment of silence, "That's the Grand Master's formation, not yours." How could you defeat him on that dilapidated pirate ship? The Immortals had made the best arrangements on how to deal with Lu Shui by developing a special formation. The problem was that the opponents still had Tong Yin and Peng Lang. When Lu Shui showed up again, who could deal with him? Chen had turned into a half-body stone statue. But he was not dead yet, and he still had one breath left. In other words, he would die after exhaling. Or, as long as someone breathed on him, he would die. He wouldn't use the last breath of his long cultivation career to talk to the immortal sword in Shang. He stared at Lu Shui and the others not far away, his cracked face showing no expression. Crack, crack, crack. Along with the sounds of metal scraping and clashing, the robot slowly and painfully stood up. After going through so many disasters and finally being hit by the pebbles, the robot really looked like a pile of scrap metal. The head in the robot was still as arrogant as usual, saying, "Hey, I say stone, you and I only have our heads left." Xin Yunmai mocked loudly. The problem is, what's the use of keeping a stone head? What was the point of holding on to this breath? Why aren't you going to die? Hearing this, all the immortals glared at him. Even He Nun frowned slightly. What are you looking at? Xin Yunmai raised his mechanical arm, stuck up his middle finger, and said, "Let's fight again if you can." En Sheng carried his broken arm and made the same gesture to him. He sat cross-legged at the edge of the cliff and recuperated while protecting his master. The immortals of the previous generations had the upper hand, and it only took them a very short time to subdue Shan Yunmai, Cain Yang, and the others. However, they did not expect Tong Yin to be so much more powerful than they had imagined. Peng Lang was even more powerful than they had imagined. Daoless Wundao suddenly exploded, and Lu Shui descended from the sky. Now that Daoless Wundao was dead, Chen Yu could be considered dead as well. The sword fairy En Sheng, He Nun, and the master were severely wounded by Peng Lang and couldn't fight anymore. The East-rising Purple Qi and Mr. Dong were knocked unconscious by Tong Yin, so they couldn't fight anymore. As a result, only 6 of them could fight, and only 3 of them were not wounded and could still maintain their prowess. Even with the help of Saint Zheng Ju, could they defeat Lu Shui and Peng Lang? I'll calculate the combat prowess of 4 people. Lu Shui can fight 3 of you by himself. Peng Lang can fight 2 of you. Tong Yin is so cunning that she must have other tricks up her sleeves. Do you accept my challenge? Xin Yunmai's voice was full of pressure. Peng Lang raised his hand and said embarrassedly, "In fact, I was just trying to scare them." He was the strongest swordsman in Chao Tian of this generation, but he was too weak to fight anymore. In addition to Chunya's sneak attack and the fairy lady's joint attack, the other reason was that he had fought against the sword wills in the universe for a long time while searching for the eye of the sword formation of the solar system. So he had consumed a great deal of his energy. Tong Yin said expressionlessly, "I can't even lift a finger. Do you want to try fighting them while carrying the nuclear power furnace?" Xin Yunmai coughed twice before saying, "What's the point of fighting then?" Sung Ju said sentimentally, "Let's call a truce. Do you really want all the fairy ladies to die in this fight?" "You should surrender then," said Xin Yunmai. "I don't mind surrendering, but I can't bring myself to do it," Guz was said with a sigh, unlike the cunning and formidable devil lady in black. His brother Gu Yu said expressionlessly, "That's right. If we let them go, they might be able to dismantle the great formation of the Grandmasters." Xin Yunmai snapped angrily, "He's my father, not your grandpa. Why do you care so much about them? You want to dismantle the formation, which means you want to go to the ancestral star and harm the Grandmasters." One of the fairy ladies sneered and said, "The Grandmasters are the ascended ancestors and have contributed greatly to the human race. Why should he be harmed by you deceiving and destroying the ancestors? The Grandmasters have indeed made countless great contributions to the human race." Master Yun's voice rang out, sounding puzzled and sad. "But does that give him the right to kill Dan, Wu Wei, and so many people?" Upon hearing this, the 2 devil ladies in black fell silent, and the fairy lady stopped talking. Enshing opened his eyes and looked at the night sky. He and the fairy ant walked up behind him and also looked at the night sky. There was a small and blue planet in the distant sky. What were the silent fairy ladies thinking? It's meaningless. Master Yun's voice rang out slowly and heavily again. He didn't look at the distant ancestral star like the others, but at the place where Taoist Wen died. Not long ago, Taoist Wen's huge sword seemed to be about to cut the heaven and earth apart, and it directly touched the sword formation across the solar system. He wanted to cut the heavens and then be cut to death by the heavens. The entire galaxy has been locked down by that sword formation. We're fighting to our deaths here, but we can't even leave this planet. How is this a battle of the gods? It's just a fight on the snail's horn. How laughable. Master Yun sighed and said, "After cultivating for 1,000 years, do you still not understand?" Having said that, he stepped on a cloud and floated down the cliff. The ancestral master opened his eyes and looked at Master Yun's back. "We're not doing this for our own selfishness, but for the entire human race. How is it laughable?" Master Yin didn't even turn around. He said calmly, "Is it for our own human race, or for ourselves among the humans?" The pure white cloud floated down the cliff and into the distance, and soon disappeared among the dust of Mars. This former fairy lady of virtue had left just like that. 1,000 years passed. The people on the cliff quieted down, and no one spoke for a long time. The silent atmosphere was eventually broken by Shun Yun Mai. "What are you still doing here? Let's give these old guys some time to daydream." The shabby robot opened its mechanical arms and carried Yuan Chu, Yu Shan, Kei Nyang, and Su Zai in its arms, as if it was carrying a pile of old clothes, and walked down the cliff. Lu Shui and Peng Lang eyed each other. Peng Lang put the curved sword back into his belt and landed on the shoulder of the robot with the tip of his foot. Lu Shui put away the 10,000 soul banner and the 2 flying swords. He looked at the seal of the king of the underworld uneasily and put away carefully. Then he put Tong Yin on his back, nodded to Tsung Ju, and left with the robot. The heavy footsteps of the robot echoed on the ground, as well as in the minds of those immortals of the previous generations. They didn't withdraw their gazes until the head of the tall robot disappeared from their sight. Chinya didn't withdraw his gaze, nor could he complete this action. He stared in the direction where the group of people disappeared, his eyes full of indifference and indescribable emotion. He looked like a righteous man who was about to watch the death of a treacherous official, like a child who was staring at a goldfish, and like a stone sculpture whose upper body had been overworked by a sculptor. Tsung Ju walked to the front of him and intended to say something, but he didn't know what to say. In the end, he could only heave a sigh. Mount Olympus was the highest mountain in the solar system, but it covered a large area. Except for the 2 cliffs at the top of the mountain and the edge, the rest of the mountain was a flat slope. The tall and shabby robot walked out smoothly while carrying those guys, and then jumped off the cliff. Fortunately, the robot didn't fall apart. After leaving the foot of the mountain, the group continued marching toward the plateau in the northwest. They passed by the place where Peng Lang had fought twice, and the traces of the burning fairy blood could still be seen. For some reason, they walked on foot in silence. Fortunately, their speed was fast, and it didn't take long for them to reach the side of the plateau. The ruins of human buildings they discovered after coming to Mars were here. Yuan Chu and Yu Shan had even come here once. It was a circular base, somewhat similar to the base on Planet 857. In the corners that were not buried by the wind and sand, traces of chemical fuel burning over hundreds of thousands of years could be seen. This circular base should be an early human civilization or a product of childhood. Most of the building materials were some kind of alloy. After withstanding hundreds of thousands of years and the tremors of the Battle of the Fairies today, it didn't collapse. It was very sturdy. It could be imagined that after human civilization was able to leave the ancestral planet, the level of technology had improved very rapidly. Except for the alloy walls, most of the things in the building had decayed, and some had even been erased by time. The entire ruins were filled with a sense of desolation. They came to a room deep in the base, and after confirming that the fairies on the mountain should not be able to see them, Lu Shui said, "Get ready." Having said that, A dozen sword wills came out from his body as fast as lightning. Peng Lang drew out his curved sword and tapped the air a dozen times at an unimaginable speed, scattering the soul fires and sending them into the empty space. Lu Shui thanked Jing Jiao and sat down cross-legged to recuperate. His pale face had gradually recovered. Though his mastery of the inherited heaven sword was much better than that of Jing Jiao, his mastery of it was far inferior to that of the dead dog. He had taken a risk to barge into the solar system with Sungju this time. In order to find this life gate, he had withstood a great many sword wills and sustained severe internal injuries. Moreover, he had exerted the most powerful attacks on the cliff. As such, he couldn't suppress the sword wills that had invaded his body any longer. If those fairies on a mountain found out his true condition, it was hard to tell what would happen. It was not until now that Yuan Shu and the others learned that Lu Shui had been suppressing his injuries. They couldn't help but feel worried. I didn't expect you, a person with thick eyebrows and big eyes, to be so good at acting, Suzai said feebly. Kane Yang looked at Tong Yin and asked, "Did you know it beforehand?" "If it weren't for that, I wouldn't have jumped so high just now." Shen Yunmai's voice came out from the robot. His previous arrogance and complacency were nowhere to be found. He looked extremely composed. Kane Yang thought it was no wonder that he would leave the top of the mountain on his own, despite his temperament. "Are you the rumored Lu Shui?" "Nice to meet you," Shen Yunmai said. Lu Shui had stabilized his injuries. All he needed now was some time to recuperate. Hearing this, he lifted his head and looked at the robot, asking curiously, "Are you?" "That's right. I'm the greatest of the two civilizations," Shen Yunmai said proudly. As soon as he started his lengthy self-introduction, he was interrupted by Tong Yin. "We'll talk about this trivial matter later. Where is the Master Knight Howler? We got separated not long after we got out." Thinking of the huge sword formation across the solar system and the seemingly endless time spent in it, Peng Lang's expression changed slightly. "Is it very dreadful?" Tong Yin asked after noticing this. "The sword wills in the formation are very formidable, but the real problem is that you don't know where you are. You can see the ancestral star, but you can't get close to it. You can't see anything in front or behind you." Peng Lang went on, "If the Master Knight Howler hadn't left some traces of starlight, I wouldn't have been able to find my way back." Lu Shui had the same feeling, saying, "If the life gate hadn't been orderly, Saint Zeng and I would still be drifting in the air." "It should be fine," Tong Yin said after a moment of deduction. "As long as nobody pointed out the direction to the great grandmaster of Aoyama with the green light rope like Chunya did, the dead dog should be able to hold on for a while given his familiarity with the sword formation of Aoyama." "What's going on?" Lu Shui asked the crowd in puzzlement. "Why have you all come out?" Then he turned to Yuan Shu and Yushan and asked, "Suzai didn't mention me. Have you two ascended as well?" Suzai protested in a feeble voice, "Now that you don't mention me, you shouldn't mention me." Kane Yang explained, "The young Master Tong Yin sent a message back to Chao Tian, saying that my teacher was in danger. As such, we came up with a way to set up a large formation to send us out as helpers." Yuan Shu asked worriedly, "Is Senior Master all right?" Lu Shui didn't know if his young master was all right or not, so he told them about what had happened a few days ago. After Tong Yin went to the black battleship to rescue Shen Yunmai, she went to Chao Tian and had no contact with the outside world. Like Kane Yang and the others, it was the first time they learned that the sea of dark matter had invaded the Moonview planet and that Jing Jiao and the Snow Girl had shown up. Hearing that the Snow Girl and Jing Jiao had joined hands and killed 9 formidable Dark Ones, a few gasps broke out in the room. They had learned a great deal about the sea of dark matter on that battleship, so they knew how formidable the ultimate Mother Hives were. "My teacher is truly outstanding," Kane Yang murmured. Yushan held his 2 small hands in front of his chest, his eyes beaming as he complimented, "Senior Master is still as handsome as ever." Peng Lang was the only one who was more objective, saying, "Mother-in-law is indeed unparalleled in the world." Tong Yin interrupted their habitual expression mercilessly again, saying, "Let's start treating the wounds." Having said that, he sat down cross-legged took out the small bell and held in his hand, closing his eyes. Chapter 998. A faint and pure Taoist energy seeped out from between Tong Yan's fingers, quickly filling the whole room. Cain Yang and the others sat down one after another to regulate their breathing. Peng Lang's way of recuperating was a bit peculiar. He leaned against the wall while holding the curved sword, his eyes closed as if he had fallen asleep. Shen Yunmai asked in the central control room of the robot, "What should I do then?" The robot was quite worn out, but there were no suitable materials or devices in this base, so it was impossible to repair it. He had only one head left, and his spiritual awareness was not damaged, so there was nothing he could do. Nobody paid any attention to him. It was exceedingly quiet in the room. A few energies that seemed different but were actually similar were echoing in the room. After a long while, Tong Yin opened his eyes and found Lu Shui and Peng Lang had woken up. Then Cain Yang and the others woke up, but the tall robot was nowhere to be seen in the room. Tong Yin furrowed his brows slightly. They could tell that he was in a bad mood, because Shen Yunmai had left without permission. "You should go out and take a walk," Tong Yin said to Lu Shui. Yuan Chu and Yushan thought that Xiao he had already left. What was the point of him going out alone on the desolate Mars and the dilapidated buildings of the ancient humans? Lu Shui understood what he meant. After making sure that the sword wills that had invaded his body had been forced out, he walked toward the outside of the room. He wanted to leave for the immortals on the mountain to see, so he had to walk leisurely and casually, as if he were really sightseeing. All the others followed him out of the room. This ring-shaped base was indeed very old. It could be seen from the remaining traces that all the systems were relatively backward, especially the energy system, which used the solar energy plates. The solar energy plates, which looked like fields, extended far away, leaving only some black particles among the gravel. No wonder it's called the childhood of the human civilization. The first-level nuclear fusion hasn't been invented yet. "It's really backward," Suzai said sentimentally. But Lu Shui interpreted it differently, saying, "It's really admirable that the humans at that time ventured into the universe bravely with such a technological level." A mocking voice came out from the distance. "Suzai, did you know what nuclear fusion was 10 days ago?" A country bumpkin actually has the nerve to laugh at others. Everyone followed the sound and came to the other side of the alloy wall. They found a broken robot sitting on a stone step. Below the stone steps was a cliff dozens of meters high. Below the cliff was another world that they could not see from the top of the mountain. There were many wreckages of machines and spaceships at the bottom of the cliff, and they could vaguely make out some of their original appearances. Many years of sandstorms had covered up most of the truth, but one could still feel how tragic it was back then. If the circular base still had the feeling of the childhood of human civilization, this world was like an old house in a village that had been forgotten for many years. It was covered in green vines and gave off an unusually gloomy feeling. "I've scanned it. A small nuclear war broke out here," Shen Yunmai said. "If you want, you can dig to the bottom and find fossils of the prehistoric humans." Suzai asked in bafflement, "Didn't you say that they haven't mastered the nuclear fusion of the first level?" The robot turned its head and looked at him as if he was an idiot. "Mastery requires understanding creation, but weapons only require understanding destruction." This statement was easy to understand. Suzai's expression grew darker, and he changed the topic. "The prehistoric civilization is quite brutal. To be exact, this civilization is not the prehistoric civilization that we thought it was." Shen Yunmai started lecturing them. The prehistoric civilization where the deities lived was the rebirth of the human civilization. During the childhood of the human civilization, humans lived on the ancestral planet and couldn't leave, just like babies couldn't leave the cradle and nestlings couldn't leave their nests. They had to kill each other in order to compete for resources. They could already build a base on Mars. "Why couldn't they leave?" asked Suzai. "It's because they couldn't leave the solar system. Even if they could leave, they couldn't find a new home. What's the difference between such a small galaxy and a nest?" The tall robot stood up and walked forward along the stone steps, dropping parts along the way, making tinkling noises. For some reason, the back view of the robot was a bit funny, but it showed a hint of sadness. It was true. The solar system was the old home of the humans in their childhood. What about the current federation of the Milky Way? It was merely a slightly larger village. The technology of the human civilization was still not advanced enough. What was more despairing was that the future of the evolution of the human beings didn't seem to be very promising, and there was no possibility of a breakthrough. Breaking through the inertia of thinking? No, it was breaking through the speed of light. Only by finding a way to break through the speed of light could humans get rid of the warped void, which was like a famous sword, and gain true freedom. They could leave the local galaxy and go to a distant place, or even reach the edge of the universe, which was the origin or the end of time. Shin Yunmai had vaguely discovered this problem when he was 5 years old, so he threw himself into the arms of a young girl by the hot spring and cried until his face was covered with snot. Later, he didn't cry because of this problem anymore. Instead, he gave up on himself. Of course, his self-abandonment had no philosophical reason in the eyes of others. It was purely a mental problem. "Hey!" Tong Yin suddenly shouted. The robot halted and asked without turning its head, "How is it?" Tong Yin said, "Didn't we talk about the curvature spaceship the other day? Didn't you say it was feasible?" The robot lowered its head and said, "That's just my crude imagination." Tong Yin said, "But the evolution of the human beings has only just begun. It's far from the end." During the long journey to Chaotian on the black coffin-like battleship, the second most intelligent person in Chaotian and the second most intelligent person in the Federation of the Milky Way had had many conversations about this topic, from the sea of stars to the particle cutting. From sociology to the explosion of the nuclear power furnace, Tong Yin believed that the snow girl, the young girl, the spirit of the green sky mirror, Ping Yongka, and most importantly, Jing Jiu represented different evolutionary paths of the human beings. Though in many people's eyes, these beings were not humans. At least, they are not the result of the evolution of the human beings. The robot said, "The humans are carbon-based monkeys. If they get close to the speed of light, they will go crazy. To say nothing of surpassing the speed of light, the humans would experience a strong mutation as long as they approach the speed of light, especially from the perspective of sociology. By then, every human being would be a society. This was the distance brought about by the vast universe. Everybody has his own time." The robot lifted his head to look at the night sky as he continued. "In this regard, is my old man conducting an experiment?" By now, they had already left the ancient human settlements and arrived on the barren land on the surface of Mars. A tall and tattered robot was looking up at them. Tong Yin was wearing a black modern suit, standing behind him with her hands folded behind her back. Lu Shui had changed into a new gray checkered shirt, standing by Tong Yin. Peng Lang looked like a swordsman. Kane Yang and the other three looked like patients. This strange combination was looking up at the night sky. The robot said, "If my old man turns this place into his own world, Jing Jiu will die. Senior Master will be able to dismantle this sword formation. Wait until the Queen recovers from her injury." Yuan Chu said, "Senior Master and His Majesty have joined hands to assassinate the fairy Lady Bai Run, and now they have killed 9 Dark Ones. They have always cooperated well." The robot was still looking up at the night sky. "You mean he lured the snow girl into the sword jail of Aoyama?" he asked in a nonchalant and cold voice. Yuan Chu was the root of Shangda Peak, so he knew those secrets. He scratched his head in embarrassment, saying it was a long time ago. It was true that this past event had something to do with the sword jail of Aoyama. Now that Shangda Peak had been flattened, the sword jail was no more. The robot fell silent for a while, and suddenly said, "I heard that looking up from the sword jail is like looking out from the bottom of a well." Thinking of the manor cave full of ice and snow that he hadn't seen for hundreds of years, Yuan Chu said with a nostalgic emotion, "That passageway is actually a well." The robot raised its thick and heavy mechanical arm and pointed at the stars in the night sky, saying, "If the sun appeared there, we would also look like the mouth of a well." Every star could actually be understood as the mouth of a well, just that some wells were deep and some were shallow. The founding masters of Aoyama had turned the solar system into a sword formation, and no one could leave the fire. This was a new sword jail, and they could only look at the mouth of a well in vain. Daowetter Wudao died as soon as he took a step towards the mouth of the well. The robot said, "I don't like this feeling of not being able to breathe." Tong Yin, don't say anything. I know I don't have a body, and I don't have lungs, so I can't breathe at all. In fact, even if I have lungs, when have we ever needed to breathe? I'm talking about feelings. Do you understand feelings? Tong Yin stood in the shadow of the robot, not intending to speak at all. The rest of the people also fell silent. After a long silence, the robot suddenly raised its arms and stretched its back, saying, "Let's stop grieving over the changing seasons. Let us continue to break the formation." Tong Yin smiled. She stretched out a stone and started writing on the wall beside her. In just a dozen or so seconds, she had written a wall that was several meters long. Incomparably complicated numbers, functions, formulas, and text explanations filled the entire wall. We still have to figure out the operating rules of this sword formation. What state is the spiritual awareness of the founding masters distributed in the solar system? This sword formation is probably an amplifier. Otherwise, it's hard to explain how his spiritual awareness could travel thousands of light years and arrive in the galaxy beyond the fog. Since the spiritual awareness of the founding masters could travel through the universe, this great formation is not as simple as an amplifier. I think the key is to find the eye of the formation. If we can't find it through calculation and observation, we should be able to deduce it from the center of the formation. According to the personal experience of Shi Sui and Peng Lang, this sword formation of Aoyama in the solar system is a self-generating formation, and the center of the formation is hidden in the deepest part. Judging from the fact that Chunyi used the green light rope to attract the lethal intent of the sword formation, we might be able to determine the relative position if someone could send out a signal from the center of the formation. It sounds impossible, but I think it's quite interesting. What do you mean? The crowd started discussing it enthusiastically, their voices echoing among the remains of the human civilization. The stars in the night sky didn't blink, and they were gazing at them attentively. The starlight shone on the surface of the ocean and was reflected into the cave. The light was as gentle and beautiful as the water, but it wasn't very bright. However, it was enough for an ascended ferryman. Sitting on the ground, Zhuoruzhui read a blue-covered book carefully. This book was the latest result of the archaeology of the founding masters of Aoyama on this planet. It was a prose written by a poet with the surname Tao, describing a land of peach blossoms isolated from the outside world. The reason he was sure that the author was a poet rather than a prose writer was because the archaeology found that most of the author's works were poems. Having read the last paragraph of the story of the peach blossom spring, Jing Jiao shook his head and put the blue-covered book back into the high-class storage box carefully, and then turned off the movie. More than 30 movies had been played on the light screen that day, all of which were fast-forwarded. Jing Jiao watched them with the corner of his eye while he was reading, and he had memorized them one by one. This was the homework given to him by the founding masters. Yet, he felt that the story of the peach blossom spring wasn't as simple as homework, and it had a hidden meaning. Otherwise, why did he have to memorize this one? Obviously, the other one was much more beautiful. The fields will never return to the wild. How good is that? Can't the founding masters just retire? Why did he have to go against those juniors, especially people like Jingjiao? Ruzhui walked out of the cave and came to the beach. Looking at the strange scenery, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. He felt that the founding masters had asked him to memorize the story of the peach blossoms spring for a hidden meaning, and it was related to the scenery in front of him. According to the time, it should still be daytime, but the sun in the sky had disappeared, and he didn't know where it had gone. Not far away, the seawater was as black as ink. As the wind blew, the waves rose gently, as if it was being dipped by an invisible pen. The moon hung silently on the horizon. It was much bigger than it had been a few days ago, and its color was extremely red, like blood, with a hint of evilness. He could even see that the planets in the depths of the night sky were arranged in an inverted cross. It was like a giant sword. This sword array that spanned across the solar system was too magnificent, too unremarkable. He didn't even dare to observe it for long, as he felt that the illusory, starry sky in front of him would devour all of his spirit in the next moment. The founding masters were indeed the first ascendant of the human race. Their methods were indeed magnificent. The founding masters had ruled the Federation of the Milky Way for many years, and they had stayed on the ancestral planet. Did they intend to search through the childhood toys of the human civilization in this old house? Joie Rujui walked to the edge of the pond and looked at the founding masters fishing as usual. Is the solar system the peach blossoms spring you have created for yourself? He asked hesitantly. If it were such a wonderful place as the peach blossom spring, I wouldn't leave it for myself. Aren't you here? The founding masters put down the fishing rod and stuck it into the sand by the side, and said while pointing at a spot in the night sky, Aren't there more people coming? Rujui looked in the direction of the old hand and saw the sparks. End of this chapter. Chapter 999. As the sect master of Aoyama, Rujui had been practicing the inherited heaven sword style since he joined the sect. Being on the ancestral planet, he had a clear view of the great formation of the solar system. The tiny red planet seemed to be on the fingertip of the great Grandmaster, but its actual position was unknown. He hesitated for a while and asked the biggest question in his mind. Why is the life gate placed in the middle of the handle of the formation? Except for the fatal formation set up by Taiping Jinren in the East Ocean, where the life gate was not left, all the other formations would leave the life gate intact. The position of the life gate was very particular. The most common and classic position was hidden in the middle of the handle of the formation. The problem was that the great Grandmaster should have known clearly that the juniors he was going to deal with were mostly disciples of Aoyama, so it would be easy for him to find the life gate. Why did he choose to do so? With his cultivation base and magical powers, he could definitely place the life gate in a more secretive and dangerous place. Because we will have to go out in the future. The great Grandmaster continued. As I said, my legs are not good. If I make it too complicated, I might not be able to go out by myself. Rujui felt something was wrong. What about those people on Mars? He asked cautiously. Do you know what's going on over there? The great Grandmaster asked. Rujui shook his head honestly. I don't know either, the great Grandmaster said. The sword formation across the solar system isolated the outside universe. The people in that universe did not know the specific situation in the solar system, and those on Mars only knew the planet under their feet. Correspondingly, the great Grandmaster had no idea what was going on in the Federation of the Milky Way, even though he was very resourceful. But aren't you worried that those people will find a way to break the formation? Rujui had found a way to break the great formation of the solar system earlier than Tong Yin and Shinyunmai on Mars. He had to determine at least one coordinate of the center of the formation and the eye of the formation. The great Grandmaster ignored him. He picked up another bamboo stick and started to fish. Rujui had seen the great Grandmaster fishing by the pond or by the seashore since he came to the ancestral planet, but he did not catch anything valuable. He couldn't help but remind her, I know it's hard to break the formation, but Tong Yin is really amazing. The patriarch suddenly raised the bamboo pole that had just entered the water and waved it toward the night sky. The water droplets on the bamboo pole floated out like arrows, disappearing into the night sky. The blood-colored moon in the distance faintly changed for an instant before quickly returning to normal. The patriarch looked at the spark in the distance and suddenly sighed. Rujui didn't know what had happened, but he knew something must have happened. He asked nervously, what's wrong? The patriarch took back his bamboo pole and did not answer his question directly. He said, Is there any formation in this world that cannot be broken? I'm not a real god. Rujui asked blankly. Then what should we do next? Just wait like this. The patriarch said, Yes, wait. What are we waiting for? Rujui looked at the coconut grove on the beach. It sounded like he was asking a question, but it also sounded like he was talking to himself. The sun had disappeared into the formation, and the day was so dark that they could see the moon and the stars in the sky. The beach was silver under the starlight, but the edge of the coconut grove seemed to be on fire. Wait for Jingjio to die. The patriarch probably also felt annoyed by the futility of his fishing. He stuck the bamboo pole back into the sand and slowly stood up with the help of Rujui. The snow girl can't keep him safe all the time. Hibernation? After a long time, it will be a long sleep. He will wake up one day. The patriarch's old and slightly tired voice was carried far away by the waves. Maybe it will be a few years, maybe it will be a few decades. Anyway, I will still be alive by then. That will be the time of his death, no matter where he hides in the universe. Rujui helped the patriarch walk toward the cave. He couldn't suppress the doubt in his heart and said, "Before that, they will definitely try to kill you. What about the snow girl?" The patriarch walked slowly to the door of the cave and sat in a wheelchair. He said with a smile, "Push me to the back of the island." The smile that appeared between the wrinkles was like a fish leaping out of the waves, inconspicuous but extremely vivid. Of course, it was not a polite smile to thank Rujui, but a gesture of detachment and indifference. Rujui was extremely shocked, thinking that the patriarch didn't even care about the snow girl. The wheelchair rolled over the green flagstone road, passed through the alloy door and a device that Rujui didn't know the function of until now, and arrived at the deepest part of the cave. After passing through the small door, it was another world. This feeling reminded him of the sword jail at the bottom of the Shangda Peak. When he reached the deepest part of the sword jail and pushed open the door, he found himself in the Hermit Peaks. Of course, there were no Hermit Peaks here, nor were there any space transformations. It was just that the scenery on the other side of the island was completely different from that on the other side. Isolated by the cliffs on the island, the sound of the waves on the other side could no longer be heard. The only sound that could be heard came from a waterfall. The sea water gushed out from the crevice of the mountain on the island and fell into the quiet sea along the cliff. The drop was about 20 meters. It was amazing that this small island could cut the surface of the sea into a staircase-like structure without any space formation. The cliff was extremely steep and smooth, and the stone quality was quite special like green jade. Even if the sea water washed the cliff for millions of years, it would still be difficult to form such a landform. No one knew its origin. Rujui pushed the wheelchair to the edge of the waterfall. Looking at the blood-red full moon in the mist, he thought of the life gate, Chunya, the formation breaking, and the patriarch's indifference to the snow girl mentioned in the previous conversation. The more he thought about it, the weirder and more frightened he felt. He couldn't help but sigh with emotion. This formation of yours is so profound that it's hard to tell the truth from the falsehood. This sentence could be interpreted as a pun, but it could also be said to have a profound meaning. When the falsehood becomes the truth becomes falsehood. You should have read this sentence before, said the patriarch of Aoyama lightly. Rujui twitched his mouth and said, "I don't like that story. It's not a story, it's the human heart." The patriarch of Aoyama went on with a faint smile. Like the story written by Jingjio, it's impossible to tell the truth from the falsehood. Rujui was slightly surprised and exclaimed, "How could you read such a story? If I hadn't seen you in that story, I wouldn't have brought you here," the patriarch said softly while looking at the waterfall disappearing into the ocean. In the story The Path Toward Heaven, Rujui had appeared many times and played a large part in it, but he was still a bit different from the branch of Shinma Peak. In essence, the branch of Tianguang Peak was the direct disciple of Taiping Jinren, which was different from the branch of Jingyang. Generally died in the galaxy outside the fog, and Shin Yunmai was exiled after being subdued by Jingjio. The patriarch of Aoyama turned his head around to look at Chao Tian and saw Rujui. Rujui was the best successor of the Aoyama sect, no matter from which perspective. What he referred to was not the Aoyama sect in Chao Tian, but the business established by the patriarch in this universe. It feels rather easy to be the puppet sect master for so many years. After a moment of silence, Rujui said, I don't have any resentment toward the Shinma Peak, save for the matter of my master. It was Tong Yan's doing that Lu Ci blocked the heavenly punishment for Taiping Jinren at the West Ocean. Tong Yan was an unofficial disciple of the Shinma Peak. More importantly, the situation at the West Ocean was the result of Jing Jiu's intervention. This was the problem. I don't care about your attitude toward them. I don't care whether what you say is true or false. The patriarch reached out his skinny forefinger and swiped it in the watery mist caused by the waterfall, saying, all you need to do is to see my victory and accept my reasoning. It was like what his son Xin Yunmai had said on Mars. There might be no reasoning in the universe because the end was inevitable, but the one who could last longer would be the one who would be the one in this phase. Victory was justice? No, it was the reasoning. Having heard this, Zhu fell silent for a long time while looking at the back of the patriarch. The patriarch sat in the wheelchair right in front of him. His hands were still on the wheelchair, but he felt that the patriarch had already gone to a faraway place. At the Plum meeting in Jiaoga City many years ago, Jing Jiu was distracted while listening to the zither music played by Lien Sanyue. At the time, he had gone to a faraway place in Zhao Liu's eyes. He shouldn't exist in the human world, but he had caused so many troubles in the human world. Looking at the waterfall falling into the ocean, Zhu sighed softly in his mind. The ink-like seawater dropped down from the jade-like, smooth cliff walls like a herd of galloping horses, creating an opening on the surface of the ocean. Then, the seawater kept going downward with countless bubbles. The bubbles didn't go too deep into the ocean. They halted slowly and then floated up to the surface of the ocean. Some of the seawater falling down from the cliff walls flowed downward while being surrounded by more seawater, forming the undercurrent that was invisible to the naked eye. There was no sand or rock at the bottom of the ocean here, but countless stone slabs. It was evident that these slabs were man-made. The aquatic plants grew in the cracks of the stone slabs, swaying slowly. If one followed the roots of the aquatic plants to the bottom of the ground, one would see a large space. The space was about 1,000 meters high, and it was impossible to see the end of the space. It was unclear where it would extend to. Countless black square pagodas stood in the space in silence. They looked like tombstones, but they also looked like some ancient ritual utensils. The black square pagodas had complicated and precise circuits, exuding a faint blue glow. They formed a large formation powered by a nuclear furnace. It was unclear how this large formation was related to the one in the solar system, but its technological level was evidently much higher than that of the Federation of the Milky Way. It should have something to do with the distant ancient civilization. A few odd-shaped marine fish swam over from afar, intending to eat the aquatic plants in the cracks of the stone slabs. As soon as they arrived in this area, they sensed the shapeless waves gushing out from the underground, feeling an extreme pain. They swam back to the distant place in fear. Jing Jiu must be having a headache at the moment. The Grand Master of Aoyama drew back his line of sight from the surface of the ocean and looked at the night sky, saying, in fact, I also have a headache. Rujui said naturally, do you want me to give you a massage? The Grand Master of Aoyama waved his hand, indicating that he didn't need to do it in front of him like he did in front of Jing Jiu. Rujui smiled embarrassedly and asked, what's your headache? As you know, sometimes the sun can't be seen on the ancestral planet during the day, just like today, said the Grand Master. Rujui had read many books and records excavated by the archaeologists on the ancestral planet, so he knew the answer. You're talking about the solar eclipse, he said. That's right. In the ancient times, the humans on the ancestral planet regarded the solar eclipse as the heavenly dog eating the sun. The Grand Master said while looking at a spot in the night sky, it's a coincidence that a dog is here today. Rujui followed his line of sight and said in a trembling voice, has the Master Night Howler also come out? It said that dogs are the most loyal friends of humans, so he should be the most loyal to Aoyama. The Grand Master of Aoyama asked with a smile while rubbing his knees, I'm curious to know whom he is loyal to. The dead dog had remained neutral during the war between the Grand Master of Taiping Jinren and the immortal Jingyang. Normally, he should remain neutral between the Grand Master of Aoyama and Jingjiao. Why did he lead Tong Yin and the others to the Mars, and now wander around the solar system in search of the center of the formation? Unfortunately, he couldn't reach the ancestral planet and find the center of the formation, even though he was walking fearlessly while resisting the endless sword wills in the solar system. Zhuo Ruzhui was certain of this. The center of the formation and the pivot of the formation were hidden from each other. It was impossible to find them unless the Grand Master allowed them to reveal themselves. He pushed the wheelchair back to the other side of the island. It was unclear if the Grand Master was tired or sleepy. He sat in the wheelchair, taking a short nap with his eyes closed while listening to the ocean waves. Zhuo Ruzhui squatted down by the wheelchair, looking at the silvery beach as white as snow, the reddish coconut grove by the edge, and the sand tower not far away. He remained silent. He had been reciting books while kneeling on the beach a few days ago. As he felt bored, he built a pagoda with sand and seawater. It was similar to the stone pagoda in the Guochang Temple. Many years ago, he held the stone pagoda in the Guochang Temple for a long time. At the time, he followed the instruction of his master Lu Si and kept an eye on the great Grand Master of the mysterious dark sect for a long time. Should the great Grand Master of the mysterious dark sect be holding the pair of withered legs in the wheelchair or staring at the sturdy sand tower? A sun was hidden for the time being. There were countless suns in the universe, illuminating the lives on those planets. The morning sunlight shone down from the cliffs of the Earth's crust. It first illuminated the lawn by the edge of Shore City, and then woke up a middle-aged man who had stayed up all night. Yawning, the middle-aged man walked to the front porch with a cup of strong tea in his hand. Seeing a young girl with short hair walking by the roadside, he thought that the young people were really useless and didn't come home at night. When he saw the long-haired white cat in the bosom of the short-haired girl, he was even more startled, wondering if he should call the police. In comparison to the distant ancient civilization, it was much more convenient to keep a pet in the current Federation of the Milky Way, but such a precious white cat was rarely seen in the suburbs. The young girl's messy short hair was tousled by the morning wind, which looked like a burning flame after being dyed red by the morning sun. "Haven't you found a way to control the snow girl?" she asked expressionlessly. Ching Er's uneasy voice rang out in her ears. "I haven't found any clue. But according to the calculation result of the ocean of data, they might be here." Zhao Lei uttered, and continued walking to the other side of the lawn while holding Ada. The middle-aged man called her twice, but she didn't pay any attention to him. Ching Er continued, "Does he like this place so much? Does he regard this place as his home because he was here when he first came here? He's just too lazy to find another place." Having said this, Zhao Lei leaped over the protective net in front of her and jumped into the crack. The middle-aged man caught up with her while yelling and happened to see the scene. He couldn't help but feel astonished, and the cup of milk in his hand dropped to the ground with a thud. Chapter 1000. The distribution of the fixed stars in the local galaxy was irregular. They were neither a sphere nor a disk. They were composed of a few large galaxies that were closely packed in the middle and scattered on the outside. It had something to do with the big explosion at the end of the distant ancient civilization or the ignition of countless fixed stars by the gods. Chaotian was located on one side of the Haiyan Nebula, and the ancestral planet was farther away on the other side. The Scorpion Tail Nebula and the Galilean Passage were in another galaxy that had nothing to do with each other. Moreover, the structure of the whole galaxy was complicated and disorderly, so it was hard to have a place to pass through. At the very least, they didn't have to pass through the Stargate base to travel from the main planet to the ancestral planet. More than 30,000 battleships were heading toward the ancestral planet at the moment, subduing the rebellious planets along the way. Unexpectedly, the commander of this large fleet and the current ruler of the Federation of the Milky Way, Zhao Lei, had come to the Stargate base undetected. The female priest of the Stargate had already set off for the main planet with the main preacher Tai Yong, the head of the Xia clan, and about 10,000 other attendants. After they met up with Zhong Lizi, they would begin the work of comforting the believers and competing with the other female priests for the right to interpret the god. Zhao Lei didn't have anyone to see. She jumped into the crack amidst the surprised scream of the middle-aged man. The strong wind whistled and tousled her short hair. The temperature and humidity of the air in the crack were constantly changing. It didn't take long before she landed on a broken street lamp at the back of the street. She came to the main street along with the wind after touching the ground with the tip of her foot. The morning sun had already risen above Shou City on the ground, but the Mingxing street was still as dark as the night, as it was most of the time. Zhao Lei had lived here for a while, so she was used to the feeling of not seeing the sun. Don't leak it out. Even Tong Yin can't know about it. She said this expressionlessly as she walked past the gaming hall and glanced at the fat owner. The green girl's voice paused for a long time before she spoke again. I understand. It was evident that what Zhao Lei said was inappropriate. She said it to a certain person on purpose. What method was it? It was the method to control the snow girl. They hadn't found it yet, but they had to make the snow girl feel that she was in their hands. Chinger couldn't help but say with some complicated emotions, You don't even play chess. Why are you like this? Zhao Lei ended the communication without hesitation and continued to walk forward. The turbulence on the main planet and the terrifying changes in the universe had already affected the Stargate base. The arcade was still open, and the oil stains left by the barbecue stall from last night could no longer be seen in the market. It was unknown how many days had passed since the barbecue stall stopped. Military police could be seen everywhere on the streets. As she walked past the electronic repair shop, Zhao Lei sensed something. She looked at the shop that was temporarily blocked by the wall and raised her eyebrows slightly. Tong Yin had always been cautious. Even she didn't know Mr. Dan's identity, so she couldn't understand why there were traces of immortal qi in this place. The buildings around the street had been pierced through by the thoughtless sword. Who knew how many people had died, but now, not a single trace was left. After walking around for a while and making sure that no immortals of the previous generations were lying in ambush here, she entered the apartment building. She came to the door of her room and knocked on it softly. Standing outside the door, she could sense that the room was enshrouded by a sword formation of Aoyama, which was even more powerful than the formation she had left behind before she left. The door of the room was opened soundlessly, and the sword formation of Aoyama was dismantled. Zhao Lei walked in and found that the person she was looking for was indeed there. The soft chair was still in its original place. The snow girl was squatting on one side of the soft chair while wrapped in a quilt. Jing Jiu was sitting on the other side of the soft chair, watching the Space Army chess match on TV. His sitting posture was very straight, and his expression was very serious, as if he were having a class. It was the first time that Zhao Lei had seen him like this, and she had a strange feeling. Then, she noticed that his face had also changed. It was very unusual. She suddenly felt a bit angry. The Federation of the Milky Way was in turmoil, and the immortals were fighting against each other. The world was on the verge of being destroyed because of him, but he was hiding in this apartment building and watching TV. This should be the reason why he was angry. Zhao Lei lowered her eyelashes slightly, and then lifted her head to look at the snow girl, asking, Why didn't you contact me? Since Jing Jiu was watching TV at the moment, it meant that he had been watching TV on a regular basis. As such, he must have seen the live broadcast of the whole Federation of the Milky Way that day, seen the mechas falling down like raindrops in the sky, and saw her controlling the whole Federation of the Milky Way by the hot spring. Even if he is an idiot now, you are not, she continued. Upon hearing this, Jing Jiu opened his eyes wide and shot her a perplexed look. Ada was so nervous that he almost tore apart Zhao Lei's clothes. The white hair all over his body was spread out, not because he was ready for a fight, but because of pure fear. Fortunately, the snow girl didn't get angry because of Zhao Lei's words. She merely uttered an emotionless cry. The simple cry contained a great deal of information. It could even be called a story. The outline of the story was as follows. After leaving the Jia Lei passageway, Jing Jiu returned to the state he was in the 72 building on the moon-gazing planet, feeling curious and fearful about the dark universe. When the Snow Girl didn't know where to go, he suddenly remembered the name of a planet, the Stargate Base. After they arrived at the Stargate Base, Jing Jiu led the Snow Girl to the underground neighborhood, as if he had instinctively done so. The Snow Girl sensed the wills of Aoyama left by Zhao Liu in the apartment building, so she broke in and stayed there. After one night, the Snow Girl had recovered from her injuries and was ready to take him to the ancestral planet, but he refused to do so. To put it more precisely, he refused to wake up. He wanted to continue living as the youth in blue subconsciously. It was unclear whether he hated the headache or he had to face the Grandmaster of Aoyama. All in all, it had something to do with the program in his consciousness, the new inherited heaven sword. He didn't want to wake up, and the Snow Girl didn't bother to move. What the humans did had nothing to do with her. If Zhao Liu hadn't come in time, they might have stayed in the apartment building like they had in the 72 building. He would not wake up until a few years or decades later, when the hibernation and the low temperature could no longer control the inherited heaven sword. Even an idiot knows fear, Zhao Liu said expressionlessly. She turned to the ordinary-looking youth in a blue hoodie, wondering where that confident guy had gone. Ada heard her murmur and meowed in disdain. He thought that if there was anyone in the universe who was more afraid of death than him, it would be this guy. He would still be afraid of death, even if he were to die, not to mention that he had become an idiot. This Lord Guardian's words are so philosophical. Cry, cry. The Snow Girl looked at Zhao Liu expressionlessly. The cry was simple, and the meaning it conveyed was simple, but it was very important. Where's my stuff? Zhao Liu's sword work was one where she wouldn't regret even if she had to die, so she was very straightforward in her actions. In her many years of cultivation, she hadn't told any lies, save for the time when she cooperated with Lu Shisui and Tong Yin to kill Luo Huainan. But at this moment, she told a big lie, and she performed it perfectly. It's in the hands of Qing she said. The reason why she said it was a big lie was not because it was complicated or powerful, but because the one she wanted to deceive was the Snow Girl. The Snow Girl was no different from God. The reason why she could perform so perfectly was that she had practiced countless times on the voyage from the main planet to here. She had also simulated the scene of facing the two-mind connection of Guoqing Temple and Shui Nunnery, using the connection of heaven and men many times, so that the Snow Girl wouldn't find anything wrong. Zhao Liu didn't let the Snow Girl think too much. She continued, I don't know about the agreement between you two, but it should be given to you after you kill the Grandmaster. The Snow Girl didn't say anything more. Zhao Liu thought that it turned out that the method to control her was the same thing. If it were someone else, even someone like Tong Yin, she wouldn't be as confident as Zhao Liu to deceive the Snow Girl. Zhao Liu had entered the Snowland twice, and was one of the few human swordsmen who had reached that icy peak. The Snow Girl had shown her appreciation for her at the time. Instead of killing her, she had saved her life. As for Ada in her bosom, he was still terrified of the Snow Girl, even though he had become so powerful after swallowing the starry sky. The expression in his eyes was resentful as he looked at the butterfly not on her head. The butterfly not quivered a bit. Cold Cicada asked for permission from its master. It flew up gingerly and kowtowed to Zhao Liu in midair. Zhao Liu put Ada down on the ground. Cold Cicada landed hastily in front of Ada and turned over, baring its belly. It rubbed its claws against each other quickly, making a buzzing sound. It seemed to be anxious and excited. Ada lowered his head and rubbed his wet nose against the little fellow, a rare delighted expression showing in his eyes. After Cold Cicada ascended with the Snow Girl, Ada didn't have anything to play with when he stood by the edge of the cliff of Shinma Peak and looked into the distance. He was not used to it. When he was not used to it, he would think of it, and he would recite it once in a while to show that he missed it. In the next moment, Cold Cicada flew to the top of Ada's head, as usual. Ada leaped up lightly habitually and landed on the top of Jingjiu's head. Jingjiu was taken aback. He took Ada down from the top of his head and put him on the ground gently. The resentful expression in Ada's eyes showed again. Then he saw the large ice cube in the corner of the room. A little girl was sitting inside the transparent ice cube with her eyes closed, as if she had fallen asleep. Zhao Liu knew that the ice cube was the flower stream, and the soul of that young girl was inside it. She couldn't help but furrow her brows. Ada meowed once, and asked if they should kill her to avoid any future troubles. Before the snow girl and Zhao Liu could say anything, Ada shook his head, looking rather naive. If this young girl was like that famous cat, and a new one appeared in the radiance of the charter after she was killed, what should they do then? Zhao Liu walked to the front of the transparent ice cube and glanced at the flower stream. Then, she turned around and walked to the front of the soft chair. She lowered her head slightly and looked at Jingjiu. The two of them were very close to each other. Their faces were about the length of a comb. If necessary, she would be able to sense the breath of the other. Jingjiu was a bit uneasy. He said slowly, "Hello." "Hello," said Zhao Liu. 500 years later, they met again. The two of them stared at each other, speechless. Jingjiu didn't know who she was. He felt more and more panic when he was stared at by her bright and distinct black and white eyes. The Space Army chess game on the TV screen had already come to an end. Jingjiu picked up the remote control in a panic and switched to another channel. The channel was playing a poorly made space pirate movie, which had just reached the end. The male lead and the female lead were on that shabby pirate ship. The pirate base was exploding in the back of the spaceship. The bright but clumsy lights illuminated the faces of the young man and the woman. The mission was accomplished, so they started kissing. End of this chapter. Chapter 1001. It was quiet in the apartment. As a result, the accompaniment of the movie grew louder, and the not-so-elegant voices grew louder. Jingjiu evaded Zhao Liu's gaze and turned to the snow girl on the other side of the soft chair, saying, "I have seen this movie." He added, "I watched it with the Master Eve." It was the same movie about space pirates that he and Eve had watched in the movie theater in Foggy Mountain, but Eve left before finishing the movie. Jingjiu didn't want to talk to Zhao Liu reflexively, trying to avoid her. The snow girl was right. He didn't want to wake up at all. Zhao Liu grew angrier. "I know who Eve is," she said expressionlessly. The snow girl wouldn't participate in this conversation, and neither did Ada and Cold Cicada. Huashi was frozen in the ice. Jingjiu couldn't find anyone to help him. The apartment grew quieter, as if waiting for someone to speak. Jingjiu had no choice but to say, "Really? She's a good person." "I'm not a good person, so I'll give you only one day." Having said that, Zhao Liu sat on the soft chair, crossed her legs, and closed her eyes to rest. Jingjiu backed away uneasily. He leaned back and glanced at the snow girl gingerly, intending to ask her who this ferocious short-haired girl was. The snow girl rolled her black eyeballs. After some thought, she decided to give up the idea of helping Jingjiu since the matter had to be solved. Time passed slowly. The quietness in the apartment seemed to increase as time passed. It was deathly still. Ada felt bored. He leaped onto the table by the wall and drew close to the three-dimensional picture frame. Looking at the seemingly alive yellow cat in the frame, he meowed softly. Cold Cicada was standing on top of Ada's head, rubbing its claws soundlessly and at high speed, saying something to Ada in an excited manner. After a long while, the street outside the window suddenly brightened. It seemed that someone had turned on a particularly bright light by pressing a switch on the street. That light was the sun. Every day, the permanent star could illuminate the underground world from a distance only when it moved above the fissure, and the people here could see it. And the process would be over soon. The sunlight only lasted for a brief moment. The people in the underground block were used to the feeling of hope being reborn and then abruptly extinguished. They did not even look up at the sky. Only the military police who were called in from above subconsciously squinted their eyes and looked at the sky. Zhao Liu opened her eyes and walked to the window to look at the sky. The light was like the mouth of a well. The people stood at the bottom of the well and watched. The light quickly disappeared, as if someone had covered the mouth of the well with a slate. She turned around and walked back to the soft chair. She reached out to touch Jing Jio's face and said, "What a fool." It would be difficult for Jing Jio to wake up at this time. As long as his consciousness began to function as usual, the program hidden in his consciousness, namely, the new inherited heaven sword, would begin to corrupt his soul, trying to gain control of his body as quickly as possible. Jing Jio possessed a strong will and soul strength that were extremely rare in this universe. Therefore, this would not be a matter of an instant. It would be a very long process. It was a painful process that Jing Jio couldn't even bear, and he couldn't solve the problem in the end. Sensing the thin calluses and the slight coldness on Zhao Liu's fingers, Jing Jio felt uncomfortable. He turned his head to look at the snow girl again, in an attempt to ask for help. Fortunately, Zhao Liu pulled back her hand soon after. She walked to the front of the snow girl and asked earnestly, "Is there any other way besides turning him into an idiot?" The snow girl reached out her small and chubby hand, indicating that she could beat him to death. Ada meowed twice on the cupboard, indicating that the emperor was truly humorous. Zhao Liu sat back on the soft chair and took out a document to read it carefully. After Shi and Tong Yin came to this world, they had deduced the current situation of Jingjio through Ran Handong and the others. Tong Yin had learned a great deal from Mr. Dan. He had read many books and books in the praying hall of the University of Stargate and in the library of the University of Stargate, and he had come up with some solutions. How did the new inherited heaven sword work on the all-in-one sword? That is, on Jingjio's body. This was a conjecture that had yet to be answered. However, the solutions he had come up with seemed to be quite sensible. They were all focused on reducing the strength of Jingjio's awareness and cutting off the energy source of the program. In fact, the snow girl making Jingjio hibernate or turning him into an idiot by using the cold intent was one of the solutions Tong Yin had come up with. Jingjio's brain might not have any cortex or neuron cells, but it should be a similar system in terms of its foundation. To reduce the speed of his awareness, the physical method was to suppress the brainwaves and interfere with the transmission of information between the neuron cells. In addition, there was another method, which was to isolate the connection between his neuron cells and the system, and to suppress the transmission of brainwaves by force. The suggestion given by Tong Yin was to attack with a high-energy heavy particle beam. The problem was that this method might not be able to break through Jing Jio's defense. If it could, it would be very dangerous. Zhao Liu had come up with a method to replace the high-energy heavy particle beam, but it hadn't been verified by the experiment. In fact, it was impossible to verify it. It was because there was only one Jing Jio in the universe, and he was the only one in such a state. Should he take the risk? If the experiment failed, his awareness would suffer an irreparable damage, even if the snow girl made him hibernate again. In other words, he might become an idiot who couldn't wake up from his eternal sleep. Looking at the youth's childish face and his bewildered eyes, Zhao Liu didn't say anything for a long time. She, who had always been decisive, hesitated at the moment. Time didn't even pay attention to the will of God, but it would change its speed according to people's emotions. When people were hesitating, time would move faster than usual, and the final line would suddenly appear in front of them. The street lamps that had never been extinguished grew brighter, signifying the arrival of the night. The military and police on the street dispersed for dinner, leaving only a few people on duty. The gate of the game hall was still closed, but it had been secretly opened. The electronic, synthesized female voices from the various gambling machines were very low. In the corner of the market blocked by the warehouse, the famous barbecue stall in the Minshang Street also quietly moved out. The charcoal fire began to bring out the aroma of food and seasoning. The aroma quickly faded with the wind. It didn't disturb the sleepy military and police on duty. When it floated past the window of the apartment, it was smelled by Zhao Liu. It was the smell of grilled eggplant, ale, and bitter gourd. No matter where human beings were, or even if they weren't human, as long as they were alive, they would try so hard to live before the end. Zhao Liu took a deep breath and made up her mind. The last moment would come, and Jingjiu had to solve this problem. Instead of waiting for a few more days like an idiot, it was better to wake up and take a gamble. "Your Majesty, please stop the magical power," she said to the Snow Girl. The Snow Girl tilted her head slightly and looked at her to make sure that she was not joking. The look in her eyes was slightly strange, but she still raised her round little hand. A solid chill floated out from between Jingjiu's eyebrows. The temperature in the apartment suddenly dropped by dozens of degrees. The window glass was covered with a thin layer of frost, and it thickened at a speed visible to the naked eye until it turned into a whole piece of thin ice. The chill returned to the Snow Girl's little hand. Jingjiu slowly closed his eyes as if his soul had been drawn out. His fingers trembled slightly, and the speed of trembling grew faster and faster. Dense and continuous knocking sounds came from between his fingers and the armrest of the soft chair. Ada knew that the critical moment had come. He turned into the study without hesitation and closed the door with a kick of his back foot. It was not that he didn't worry about Jingjiu, but he believed that he would be fine more than Zhao Liu, so he didn't want him to wake up and find himself in the most pitiful state. When the knocking sound of fingers and armrest became a long sound, Jingjiu still closed his eyes tightly and didn't open them. His long eyelashes trembled slightly, but the frequency was very fast. If a drop of water fell on them, it would be cut into many pieces. Zhao Liu stood in front of him and looked at him in silence. The thoughtless sword appeared in her hand, emitting a blood-like light. Click! Jingjiu's fingers stopped moving, no longer trembling. His long eyelashes also stopped trembling. He opened his eyes, but didn't wake up. There was a hint of pain deep in his blank eyes, like a storm that was about to take shape and become more violent. Zhao Liu held the two ends of the thoughtless sword and pulled hard. With a clear sword sound, the blood-red flying sword turned into a sword rope. She tied the sword rope around Jingjiu's neck. Jingjiu looked at her in bewilderment, not knowing what she was going to do. His expression was innocent, like a wounded animal. "Don't pretend. We all know each other." Zhao Liu thought of this expressionlessly, as she pulled the sword rope tightly with both hands. Her movement was very rough, even violent. Many years ago, when Jingjiu passed by Zhaoga City in the snow, he saw her in her mother's belly and left a bracelet for her. That bracelet was the sword rope she used later. At the beginning of the story, it was used to tie up Taiping Jinren in a restaurant in Cloudy Town. Later, she and Jingjiu participated in the inherited sword competition and climbed the Shima Peak together. It was Jingjiu who used this sword rope to tie her up and bring her to the peak top after she fell unconscious. This sword rope was the thoughtless sword. She brought the thoughtless sword back to Jingjiu that day, but the way she did it was a bit special. She exerted more and more force on the sword rope, and her palm, which was larger than that of a regular woman's, exuded a faint fairy energy. Jingjiu's face grew paler and paler. He clutched the sword rope with both hands, wanting to say something, but he couldn't. Fortunately, his body was too special. Otherwise, his head and body would have been separated from his body. "Ada!" Zhao Liu yelled. Ada didn't dare hide in the study room any longer. He turned into a flash of white light and came to the living room, throwing himself onto the soft chair. The clean heart bell, which had been tied around his neck for 500 years and had been washed by the starlight many times, finally rang again. The crisp sound of the bell echoed in the room. Along with the sound of the bell, Jingjiu put down his hand gradually, and his eyes became clearer, but the pain in the depth of his eyes grew more intense, and he even started to pant. Dozens of sword lights drifted out from the corners of Zhao Liu's sleeves. She had entered the shapeless sword body state and used the 9 Deaths sword style of Shinma Peak to infuse countless terrifying sword wills into the sword rope. The thoughtless sword was the most bloodthirsty and vicious sword among the 9 swords of Aoyama. At this time, its killing intent was even more intense, filling the entire room with blood. It didn't even look like a treasure weapon of a righteous sect. It was countless times more terrifying than those evil weapons. Not too long after, all the killing intent, bloody light, and sword wills were retracted back into the sword rope. The sword rope became bright red and crystal clear, just like a red necklace. Zhao Liu tied a dead knot on the sword rope, then finally loosened her hand. Jingjiu was no longer in pain like before, and his breathing gradually calmed down. Zhao Liu stared at his eyes without saying anything. Ugh, ugh. From start to finish, Xueji didn't do anything, only crouched down next to him, her black eyes carrying a rare curiosity and even rarer seriousness. She was really curious about what method Zhao Liu used. Could it be that she used the invisible sword wills as heavy particles? You can't let him think, but you also don't want him to be so muddle-headed and irresponsible, so you just have to wake him up and then stop him from thinking, Zhao Liu explained. Xueji showed a rare moment of confusion, thinking, what does that mean? The mind is the most uncontrollable thing. You want him to stop thinking just because you tell him not to? Zhao Liu said, that's why you have to use this sword. This is the thoughtless sword. Thoughtless. But he doesn't want to. Perhaps it's a coincidence, or perhaps it's fate. In the end, spiritual master Scenic Yang's first sword fell on his own neck. Such a dangerous method, yet Zhao Liu used it on him. How powerful! Jingjiu's breathing grew steadier and longer, until it disappeared completely. The expression in his eyes grew calmer, clearer, and finally more tranquil. His eyebrows and eyes grew more beautiful and perfect, yet his face was still as pale as before, and it was evident that he was much thinner than before, looking like a patient who had been bedridden for many years. The blood-red sword rope had cut off most of the connection between his mind and his body, and it had even reduced the activity of his mind by a physical method. He blinked a few times and woke up. Looking at Zhao Liu in front of him, he asked softly, "You're here." Zhao Liu uttered him. Regardless of whether she meant ascending from Chaotian or coming to this apartment, she had come to his side. I didn't expect you to find me. Jingjiu still spoke slowly, and he seemed even weaker than before, like a person who was seriously ill. His tone had a hint of regret. Zhao Liu thought that he had said that he would be able to see the sun as long as it was there, even if the sun was much dimmer than usual. Even if it only appeared in the sky for a split second like what had happened earlier. Ada stared at Jingjiu while crouching on a soft chair. Jingjiu attempted to reach out his hand to touch Ada, but he found that he couldn't lift his arm, and he couldn't even feel his fingertips. He had soon figured out his current situation. He turned his head slowly to Zhao Liu, saying, I'll die sooner if I do this. You taught me this, said Zhao Liu. Jingjiu said, I've only wielded my sword on my big brother, but I've never killed my master. Zhao Liu said to him, You taught me how to use the sword. What he practiced at the Shima Peak was the 9 Deaths sword style. He wouldn't regret it even if he died 9 times. Since he was Jingjiu, he should live proudly and clear-headed. He shouldn't regret it even if he died. End of this chapter. The other thing is that the composite material particles are wrapped in some kind of expired culture fluid, Zhao Liu said. Jingjiu didn't think much of it and said, The bucket that holds Xunyun's head? The officers and soldiers on the Scorching Sun battleship had all seen him carrying the bucket. Yes, and I suspect that Tong Yin is also on that battleship, said Zhao Liu. What kind of weapon is it? Asked Jingjiu. What kind of weapon did the Federation of the Milky Way have that could turn the battleship of the Shun family into particles that even Shun Yunmai and Tong Yin couldn't escape? Zhao Liu said, That galaxy might have been turned into a sword formation by the great Grandmaster. This shocking conclusion didn't cause any change in Jingjiu's expression. It was because he was too weak at the moment and didn't have the energy to respond to it, and he didn't think it necessary. The great Grandmaster sent a warning signal. The Scorching Sun battleship stopped in advance. Then they conducted a few experiments and determined the range of the sword formation. After a pause, Zhao Liu continued, "But they couldn't observe the situation inside the sword formation, and we didn't know if Shun Yunmai and Tong Yin were still alive. As such, I asked Lu Shui to go in and have a look." Upon hearing this, Jing Jiu reacted. He shot her a glance, but didn't say anything. Ada wanted to let out a mocking sneer, but he yawned hastily to cover it up when he thought of how Ru Zhao Liu was to Jing Jiu. That was Lu Shui. How could you use him as a stick for the blind? You were truly heartless. Zhao Liu was aware of what was on Jing Jiu's and Ada's minds. He has cultivated the golden body of the Zen sex a long time ago, and I gave him all the powerful magic treasures in Chaotian. I want him to be the god of death. Now that he is the god of death, he should be the vanguard. Jing Jiu shot her another glance, thinking that this was not her temperament. Zhao Liu said with a complicated emotion, "Of course, I can do something, but I couldn't compete with him during the meeting in Chaotian." Still looking at her in silence, Jing Jiu thought that this was still not her temperament. She might lose in the competition for the sword or the honor, but she would never admit defeat. It was impossible for her to lose in the competition. More importantly, who in the Aoyama sect or the whole cultivation circle in Chaotian would dare compete with her? Zhao Liu didn't respond to the inquiry in Jing Jiu's eyes. Ada meowed softly. By now, Jing Jiu realized that it was because he had lost in the mahjong game. He didn't recall the sesame paste and mahjong on the Shinma Peak and the Shangda Peak. All he thought was that it was troublesome. A galaxy had become a sword formation. It was truly troublesome. It's really troublesome, Jing Jiu said expressionlessly. This was the mantra of the immortal Jingyang. He had finally said it again after many years. It meant that he had encountered a serious problem that he hadn't encountered for many years. All these troubles are caused by you, so you should solve them by yourself. Every child understands this. Zhao Liu said, "Don't always try to escape by sleeping." Looking back at his long years of cultivation, Ada thought that it was indeed true. It was shameful and useless to escape. Jing Jiu didn't like the feeling of having the sword rope tied around his neck, but he couldn't even lift a finger. There was nothing he could do about it. He didn't like being lectured by Liu, as if she were lecturing a child either, but there was nothing he could do about it. As such, he closed his eyes and said, "I want to take a rest." This was not a silent protest. It was because he was truly weak and uncomfortable, and he needed to rest. The light from the street lamp passed through the glass and shone on his beautiful and pale face, but it didn't warm him up. His long eyelashes quivered slightly, but they soon returned to normal. He had truly fallen asleep. Standing in front of him, Zhao Liu didn't have the feeling of looking down on him. It was because her eyes were full of worry. She repeated it again. They hadn't seen each other for 500 years, and this was the situation. She didn't have the time to feel sentimental before she had to worry about his life and death. It was indeed troublesome. Ada meowed once to comfort her, thinking, "Back when I was in the Guochang Temple, I slept every day. You people also thought that I was old and on the verge of death. Look, I'm quite energetic now." The television was turned off. Zhao Liu stared at Jing Jiu in a daze. The snow girl was in a daze while wrapped in a quilt. Huashi was in a daze in the ice cube. Ada was in a daze while crouching on the windowsill while holding cold cicada in his arms. The street lamps were a bit dimmer, meaning that the morning sun had risen over Shoer City again. Without the morning sunlight, Jing Jiu started coughing as soon as he opened his eyes. The coughing grew louder and more painful, waking up the snow girl, the human, the cat, and the cicada who were in a daze. Zhao Liu felt relieved after she was certain that Jing Jiu was awake. But she was still worried when she heard the coughing and saw his feeble appearance. The snow girl turned around and glanced at Jing Jiu twice with interest, thinking that it was an interesting method that worked, but it was a bit too overbearing. Zhao Liu reached out her hand and stroked Jing Jiu's chest. It was because she had never done such a thing before, so her movement was a bit clumsy. Jing Jiu calmed down a bit. "Do you think I can sense it?" he asked Zhao Liu earnestly. The thoughtless sword was tied to his neck, cutting off the connection between his awareness and his body. In a sense, he was a patient with high paraplegia. His body wouldn't tremble even when he coughed the most. Under such circumstances, it was meaningless for Zhao Liu to massage his chest. "Can I feel better?" Zhao Liu showed a rare feminine demeanor. After a moment of silence, Jing Jiu asked, "How is Nan Wang?" Zhao Liu said, "It's still early. She's fine." Jing Jiu said, "I've almost forgotten that she is worshipped by the people in the south." Zhao Liu said, "She often thinks the incense is too strong, so she feels a bit hot." Jing Jiu suddenly said, "I'm a bit cold." Yesterday, the snow girl drew the coldness out of his body, but he felt colder and colder. His body couldn't feel Zhao Liu's hand, so he shouldn't be able to feel the cold or the heat. Moreover, the immortals were immune to cold and heat, and his body was different from others. This coldness was not physical, but spiritual. It might be the result of his awareness being blocked. Zhao Liu didn't know how to solve this problem, so she turned to look at the snow girl. The snow girl wrapped herself tightly in the small quilt, indicating that she shouldn't think about it. Zhao Liu walked into the bedroom, found a blanket in the wardrobe, and covered Jing Jiu's body with it. The blanket was large enough to cover Jing Jiu from head to toe. Zhao Liu tucked the upper edge of the blanket into the sword rope and nodded with satisfaction. The sword rope was really suitable for this purpose. Ada wondered inwardly, "Is this a bib for an infant who can't eat?" It was then that he suddenly sensed a cold gaze. He turned around and found the snow girl was staring at him, feeling startled. Cold Cicada flew away from him without hesitation and landed on the head of the snow girl, turning into the shape of a butterfly knot. The window was broken, the glass shards falling down to the street after being shone on by the street lamps. It was a beautiful scene. The snow girl arrived in the sky above the street, her hands behind her back, her expression nonchalant. The quilt on her body ruffled slightly in the wind. The transparent ice cube was following behind her. While she was still closing her eyes inside the quilt, unwilling to wake up. The sounds of the mosquitoes conveyed the irritable mood of the queen. "Hurry up. What are you waiting for? Let's finish our business as soon as possible." Zhao Liu lifted the soft chair with one hand and glided to the outside of the window, flying upward along with the snow girl. The street lamps grew farther away, and the cliff walls grew darker. Soon, a patch of real light appeared in the sky, looking like the mouth of a well. The populace in the underground neighborhood, the workers on the cliff walls, the morning joggers in show or city, and the preachers in the praying hall and the fire-passing pagoda all saw the white smoke that disappeared as soon as it appeared. The temperature of the entire Stargate base dropped a bit. Many people bowed to the white smoke reflexively. The white smoke passed through the atmosphere and entered the space. Soon, it flew out of the solar system and entered a battleship waiting there in silence. Jing Jiu tried his best to keep his eyes open during the entire process. He had done many things and seen many sceneries in his life, but he had never had the experience of flying while sitting on a soft chair. The thousands of officers and soldiers on the battleship had a new life experience that day. The ear-piercing alarm had just rung out when it was deactivated by the system. The cabin door wasn't opened, but a strange group appeared in the command hall. There was a little girl covered in a quilt. The quilt was not big enough to cover her feet, and there was a distance of a few millimeters between the quilt and the floor. There was a beautiful man lying paralyzed in the chair, covered by an ordinary blanket, on which a white cat with long hair was obviously extraordinary. The man leaned against the corner of the chair weakly, with a pale face, looking extremely weak. Was he the rumored patient? The appearance of the little girl was unclear, and only a few strands of white hair could be vaguely seen. Was she the rumored albino patient? In the current Federation of the Milky Way, the government was in charge of the first gene modification. It was rare to see such a case, not to mention that there were two of them at the same time. And how did they get on the battleship? The only normal one was the young girl with short hair, but the officers and soldiers were startled when they saw her face. The captain of the battleship drove all the soldiers out of the command hall with a stern expression in his eyes. He walked to the front of Zhao Liu and said humbly, "You're back," Zhao Lei uttered, and walked forward while carrying the soft chair with one hand. If those officers and soldiers hadn't left and witnessed the scene, they would have found that she was also an abnormal person. The longer the captain looked at Jing Jiao on the soft chair, the more shocked he felt. "Is this Mr. Advisor?" he asked tentatively. "He's paralyzed," Zhao Lei replied. The captain was even more shocked, thinking that the Mr. Advisor should be the mastermind behind this rebellion. How could he suddenly be paralyzed? However, the medical level of the Federation of the Milky Way could easily solve the most troublesome case of hyperalysis. "The medical area is over there," he said. Zhao Lei came to the front of the large French window and put down the soft chair, saying expressionlessly, "Let's set off according to the original plan." Ada lifted up his head lazily and shot a glance at the foolish captain, wondering if he could find a scalpel that could cut open this guy's skin. Regardless of whether it was a high-pressure water scalpel or a ray scalpel, he would eat it. No, he would snatch one to defend himself. The news that Jing Jiao, the former chief advisor of the military, was paralyzed soon spread on the battleship, triggering much conjecture and shock. The battleship quivered slightly, and the crystal engine shot out blue flames. The battleship started its long voyage to the ancestral planet along with various self-examination instructions and the sound of data verification. Jing Jiao was sleeping most of the time on the long voyage. He appeared to be sleeping, but he was actually awake. He used to draw, play the zither, and play chess on the full moon planet. He appeared to be awake, but he was actually asleep. He was so weak at the moment that he didn't even want to waste the energy to open his eyes. He would rather close his eyes to rest and talk to Zhao Lei. It was rare for Zhao Lei to see him throw a tantrum. She knew that he was under too much pressure, so she didn't take it seriously and laughed more often. The starlight outside the window was sometimes bright and sometimes dim, illuminating his pale face. Once in a while, he would wake up and cough a few times, looking like a sickly beauty. He was the kind of person in classical novels who would die at any moment due to tuberculosis. One day, as the battleship passed by a huge black hole in the distance, Jing Jiao opened his eyes and looked at the place he couldn't see. He didn't move his eyes away for a long time. Sitting on the transparent ice cube, the snow girl also looked at the black hole. She drew back her gaze when she found that she couldn't win. Zhao Lei squatted down by his side and pulled the blanket over his knees, asking, "What's the matter?" "Boring," replied Jing Jiao. Zhao Lei waved her hand to signal the captain to push a wheelchair over. The snow girl turned around and took a look, but didn't pay attention to it. Zhao Lei picked up Jing Jiao along with the blanket. Looking at the blanket hanging from Jing Jiao's body, the captain said with a smile, "It looks like a magic trick." Ada glanced at the man lazily, wondering how he became the captain of the battleship if he was so eager to speak without thinking. Zhao Lei put Jing Jiao on the wheelchair and tidied up the blanket, saying to the captain, "We're just going to walk around. Don't disturb us." The order was passed on quickly. Zhao Lei pushed Jing Jiao on the wheelchair, walking casually in the battleship. Ada was lying on Jing Jiao's knees, looking around and scratching the blanket subconsciously from time to time. No one dared to speak or even look at him. It was so quiet in the battleship that the only sound they could hear was the sound of the wheelchair rolling on the ground. The wheelchair stopped by the window on the side of the battleship. The sky outside the window was still full of stars. Zhao Lei let go of Jing Jiao, walked to him, and squatted down. She touched Ada's back and asked, "Have you figured out how to kill the Great Grandmaster?" Jing Jiao said after a long moment of silence, "I figured it out before my ascension." Of course, it didn't mean that he had planned to kill the Great Grandmaster at that time. It was only then that he understood how to get rid of all control and gain true freedom. Chapter 1003. Thinking of a method didn't mean that it would work. First of all, one had to be able to carry out the method. The problem was how to break through the great formation of the solar system and land on the ancestral planet. Second, one had to be able to carry out the method. It was evident that Jing Jiu didn't have the ability to do so he didn't have the courage to do so. As for what the method was, Jing Jiu wouldn't tell him, and Zhao Leia wouldn't ask either. She squatted by the wheelchair and looked at his face. His face was perfect in the eyes of the world. She was the only one who could clearly see the small crack at the corner of his eye. It was because she had seen it the most and paid the most attention to it, and the small crack on his earlobe. She pinched his earlobe with her fingers and rubbed it gently, saying, "I'll massage it for you if you feel uncomfortable later." Looking at the scene reflected on the window and the red necklace on his neck, Jing Jiu sighed. The long voyage was coming to an end. The battleship passed through a warped black hole and completed the last space jump, jumping into a sea of stars. The high-strength composite plates were opened, and everything outside the window could be seen clearly. Even the soldiers who had been in the space all year round couldn't help but feel sentimental when they saw such a spectacular scene. Even the central region of the galaxy couldn't have such a large number of stars. Those stars were the battleships of the Federation of the Milky Way. More than 30,000 battleships were waiting for their arrival. The largest fleet in the universe began to move, forming a river of stars that looked incomparably magnificent. A gray command battleship was in the front. The Snow Girl didn't need to pass through the warped black hole anymore. She flew out and stood on top of the battleship. The small quilt in the underground apartment had been replaced by a red cloak made of super tiny particles. There was no wind in the space, but the red cloak was fluttering. It was because she thought it looked better. That transparent block of ice was floating not far behind her. It was as if there was an invisible string tied to Xue Jie's body. While she was floating and rotating slowly in the transparent ice cube with her eyes closed, as if she were a fetus in the womb. Many battleships were observing and recording the scene. They were so shocked that they didn't dare make any comments. Not long after, a very small white suddenly appeared in the dark background of the distant universe, but it was obviously different from the stars in the distance, indicating that it was not far away. The dim light passed through the glass and fell into the battleship. It didn't have any effect, but it made Jing Jiu squint his eyes. The ancestral star was over there, so this little white dot must have been the original, real sun. He thought of the saying from many years ago, "When you come to the human world, you must look at the sun." I saw it for you. Of course, the sun could be seen from Mars, and it was many times bigger and clearer than when seen from outside the galaxy. However, there was no need to calculate it all. Right now, the immortals on Mars could tell from their relative positions that the sun was not where they saw it. It was also possible that it was not what they saw. The seemingly mysterious but actually brutal and bloody battle of the immortals came to a temporary halt. The immortals of the previous generation stayed on the highest mountain, while Tong Yin and the others went to the base built in the early days of human civilization. The two sides maintained a distance of hundreds of kilometers and, at the same time, maintained extreme vigilance. Other than the dead Taoist Wen and Chunya, there were many people on both sides who were heavily injured. The injuries and pain of the immortal body were not a problem for the immortals who had achieved great Tao, but there was no chi of heaven and earth on Mars, and the chi of the sun was isolated by the sword formation, so it was a very troublesome matter. In the base, Tong Yin and the others had prepared enough pills, so it was better. Most of the immortals on the mountain peak came in a hurry and were unprepared, so they could not help but feel annoyed. The few immortals that were injured by Tong Yin and Peng Lang were even showing signs of worsening. The ancestral master should already know that we are at the gate of life. Even if it is to reassure us, he should have sent a message. He Xiangu retracted her gaze from the sky and said expressionlessly. The immortals noticed that the place she was looking at was where Taoist Wen had died, and could not help but fall silent. The ancestral master, God-battering, said tiredly, "An unstable Tao heart is our own business. What does it have to do with the ancestral master? And what does it have to do with the heaven and earth?" The cliff became quiet again, with only the sound of the wind brushing against the gravel. The resentful words and the unexpressed resentment meant that some of the immortals were already annoyed, but it did not mean that they would become the next Taoist Wen. No one here had marked their thoughts, but no one had ever doubted the choice of the ancestral master of Aoyama, including Taoist Wen. Taoist Wen wanted to avenge Mr. Dan and express his dissatisfaction to the ancestral master of Aoyama. Xiangu looked at Chunya and asked, "You should have a way to contact the ancestral star." Chunya was, after all, a leader, and it was not appropriate to keep his body lying on the sand. At some point, an immortal took out an incense burner table from a spatial treasure, and two immortals in black carefully carried him up. His arms were severed at the shoulder, and only a small part of his body above his chest was left. Placed on the incense burner table, it really did look like a half-body statue. Chunya was only a breath away from death, so he naturally did not answer her question. Seeing him in such a state, Xiangu felt even worse. "Only the leaders of the political circles can make half-body statues," she said. "You, a cultivation practitioner, can't you beat in such a way?" She was mocking him and angry at his helplessness, and it was also the consensus of the immortals of the previous generations. In their eyes, Chunya's level was much lower than General Li's. If General Li hadn't been killed by Jingjiu in the galaxy beyond the fog, those juniors of Chaotian wouldn't have had the chance to come here. Sometimes, when I think about it, my mistake is not to hide in the base and calculate those stars, but to use it as an excuse to ignore these matters. Sangju sighed. Both the matter of the immortal Qi song and this matter are the same. I feel embarrassed whenever I think of myself as a hypocrite. This statement was quite true. His face did feel a bit hot. He took out the fan and fanned himself a few times. The air on Mars was thin, so the small fan couldn't produce any wind, which made him feel even more annoyed. "Sir, try this one." The voice of Lu Shui rang out at the foot of the cliff. The expressions on the faces of the two devil immortals in black changed abruptly, and the rest of the immortals were ready to fight. Even the wounded Xiangu and the others looked in that direction cautiously. It seemed that Lu Shui didn't notice anything. He flew to the top of the cliff, took out a paper fan, and handed it to Sungju. Sungju took the paper fan and found it had the energy of Imatai. He unfolded it and found it was indeed much bigger than his own fan. He took it after thanking him. The immortals fixed their gazes on Lu Shui. They had been guessing what those juniors of the previous generation were up to, but they didn't expect him to come here. "What have you been doing lately? How are you?" asked Sungju. Lu Shui said, "They are calculating something, but I'm a bit stupid, so I can't figure out." Some of the immortals thought he was concealing it on purpose. They couldn't help but sneer, thinking that he was merely thinking of a way to dismantle the formation. There was no point in concealing it. Sungju unfolded the paper fan and said, "What's the matter?" Whether it was an immortal, a demon, or a human, giving a gift meant that they had something to ask of someone. "Tong, Yin asked me to bring you a message," said Lu Shui honestly. He was the successor of many sects, but Yamatai's identity was the best, and he had countless treasures with him. He was the strongest after recovering from his injuries, so he was indeed the best candidate for the negotiation. Sungju closed the paper fan and gestured for him to continue. "Tong Yin thinks that the Patriarch's plan isn't just for us, but also for the seniors." Lu Shui paused for a while, then said he wants to use this solar system sword array to trap all the ascending immortals and kill them all if the situation goes awry. Xiangu said expressionlessly, "This is the life gate. As long as there was no blue light rope pointing out the coordinates and attracting the sword will, even a master of the array couldn't kill the people in the life gate. What if the Patriarch suddenly changes the array?" Lu Shui said, "Tong Yin thinks that we should think of a way to break this array first, then we can talk about the rest." "How absurd." Guzwa sneered. "Let's not talk about how such a large sword array can be changed so easily. Let's talk about why the Patriarch wants to kill us." Lu Shui said honestly, "I also can't think of a reason why the Patriarch wants to kill you, but Tong Yin said that it was his intuition, so he must have his reasons." The divine battering master laughed and said, "The word intuition is often used to cover up absurdity and embarrassment. This statement indeed sounded absurd. If Tong Yin wanted to use this method to sow discord, it would indeed be somewhat embarrassing. Sung Ju laughed bitterly and said, "I'll go with you to take a look." Taoist Wen was already dead. Chunya was about to die. Master Yun was nowhere to be found, and there were still 10 immortals on the tattered pirate ship. No one would agree to Tong Yan's absurd suggestion. "I'll go take a look as well." The cold voice of Xiannu rang out. The immortals were all startled. The divine battering master looked at her and said with a grave expression, "Is this the path you've chosen for yourself?" Xiannu said expressionlessly, "Shouldn't you take a look first before deciding which path to choose?" The divine battering master said, "You're the only one who knows whether you're going to find a path or a person. It's none of your business," Xiannu said. Last night, another sandstorm occurred on Mars, filling the base with sand and dust. Fortunately, they were all immortals, so it was quite easy for them to clean up the place. Yushan waved his sleeve, and the white snowflakes drifted down and froze those tiny grains of sand. Then a gentle wind blew them out of the door. There were still some stains on it. Su Zai snorted coldly, and the demonic fire from the sun banner burned it all over quickly. King Yang called out dozens of bronze mirrors to bring in all the dim light from the outside. The room suddenly looked a bit brighter and cleaner. Even some parts of the tattered robot began to glow. The robot raised its 2 badly deformed mechanical arms and clapped slowly. At the same time, the voice of Xin Yunmai burst out. "The scan is done. It's so clean. If I want to put my head back on my body, I'll definitely invite you to do a sterile operation room." This was the scene Sang Juha and the Xiannu saw when they arrived here with Lu Shui. Feeling a bit embarrassed, King Yang invited the 2 seniors to come in hastily. Yet the robot didn't stop clapping. It kept on clapping, and the clapping became faster and faster with a certain rhythm. "Welcome, welcome, welcome." Tong Yin walked over from the wall and said, "Shut up if you don't want me to stick my mechanical finger into your mouth." The robot stopped moving immediately. Tong Yin said to Tseng Juha and the Xiannu, "The great grandmaster spent more than 100 years to construct this great formation. If we want to break it, we have to pool the wisdom of all of us." Lu Shui said regretfully, "It's a pity that the others don't want to come." Su Zai said in a mocking tone, "You were fighting to the death a moment ago, but now you are in the same boat. Only an honest person like you would believe what Tong Yin said." Tong Yin didn't heed him and continued, "In fact, I want to invite the 2 seniors here." Sung Juha was a sage in Yamatai. He had been cultivating the art of calculation since he was a child. After he came to this world, he had been calculating the order of the burning stars in the 857 base all year round. Xiannu was a daughter of a peasant family in Chaotian, but she had built many farming tools, water conservancy equipment, and textile machines when she was still immortal by virtue of her talent. They were indeed the best candidates to break this great formation and solve the complicated mathematical problems. "I didn't say I wanted to help you. I'm just here to take a look." Having said that, Xiannu walked to the wall and looked at it. The whole wall had been eroded by Su Zai with the poison, but it was not smooth. Many complicated formulas and data were written on it. In fact, I think it's all in vain. Even if the Snow Girl or Jingjiu were to come here, they still wouldn't be able to break this formation, let alone these 2. Xin Yunmai's voice rang out again after it had faded away for a dozen seconds. "Don't try to provoke me," said Xiannu. Xin Yunmai remarked sentimentally, "Look, this is the problem of being too familiar with each other." Sang Juha was concerned about another issue, asking, "You said that the great grandmaster set up this formation to kill all the fairy ladies. What's the basis for this? Have you read The Path Toward Heaven?" asked Tong Yin. Sang Juha nodded and said, "I've even played that game. Whatever Taiping Jinren wants to do in Chaotian is the same as what the great grandmaster wants to do in this world," said Tong Yin. Sung Ju said, "It doesn't make sense and it's illogical. Taiping Jinren wants to train more cultivation practitioners to deal with the heavenly demons of the outside world or the threat of the sea of dark matter, though he didn't know it at the time. This junior Taiping is indeed extraordinary, said Xiannu approvingly. He can predict what is happening outside the well, even when he is at the bottom of the well, and he stands at a very high position and has a very powerful method. With a bitter smile, Ju continued, "Now that we want to deal with the threat of the sea of dark matter, why does the great Grandmaster want to kill all the fairy ladies?" The expression on Tong Yan's face didn't change, as he said, "I've heard from Lu Shui about the monk Great Compassion, or the Joyful Monk. If the Grandmaster thought the humans had no hope many years ago and had the same idea as the monk Great Compassion, that is, to turn all humans into beings with souls, what would he do? It wasn't until now that the souls were still a realm that was hard to reach, be it in Chaotian or in this world, which was why it was called the Forbidden Zone. The extreme action of the joyous monk couldn't be supported by anybody. If the great Grandmaster of Aoyama had the same idea, then he might have killed all the fairy ladies first." This was the first time that Yuan Chu, Kane Yang, and the others had heard Tong Yin make such a dreadful deduction. They couldn't help but feel startled. It was quiet in the room. It didn't take long before Tsung Ju shook his head and said, "The great Grandmaster is not the joyous monk, but he is similar to Jing Jiao. A confident person like him wouldn't do such a thing." Tong Yin said, "If I remember correctly, the person behind the pastoral capitulation sect is called Qiming. It should be him." Tsung Ju still didn't accept his deduction, waving his hand frantically. Tong Yin didn't insist, saying, "Please help us think about this problem." Looking at the densely packed numbers on the wall, Tsung Ju soon found the key point. "Isn't it about to be calculated?" he asked with a slightly changed expression. What they had been calculating over the last few days was the description of the formation I of the solar system sword formation. If the mathematical description of the formation I was accurate enough and had enough dimensions, it would be possible to determine its spatial coordinates. A few values are not correct, let alone the energy description. The mass of the formation I has a problem. Tong Yin continued, "The mass of the formation I we calculated is too great, even greater than that of Pluto. There is no such celestial body in the solar system. The handle of the solar system sword formation, which was composed of the 8 planets arranged in a formation, was naturally excluded from the selection of the formation I." Tsung Ju thought this was indeed a problem. He lifted his wrist to bring out the terminal and started running the programs on the wall again. "It's a battleship, Fairy Nun," he suddenly said. Her voice was devoid of emotion, but the others' emotions were fluctuating violently. Kane Yang let out a soft cry, feeling both upset and surprised. End of this chapter. Chapter 1004. Like Kane Yang, Yuan Shu and the others were annoyed after seeing the light, wondering why they hadn't thought of such an obvious thing. According to the calculation, the space coordinates of the formation I of the sword formation of the solar system were constantly changing. They always thought it was a natural celestial body, such as a small planet, and they didn't consider the human spacecrafts. Now that they thought about it, if the formation I was a battleship, all their doubts would be explained. Suzai said in a self-mocking tone, "Have we become stupid after cultivating so much that we couldn't even think of this?" Then he looked at Tong Yin and said in a mocking tone, "It's understandable for us, but you always thought that you were the most resourceful one. Why didn't you think of it?" "I did." The expression on Tong Yan's face was calm, unchanged by what the fairy nun said. "But according to the mass of the formation I, this battleship must be very large, more than 70 times larger than the largest long-distance carrier. The Federation of the Milky Way doesn't have such a large spacecrafts. The long-distance carrier was a huge battleship used by the Federation to evacuate the populace from the Scorpion Tail Nebula, which could accommodate 80,000 people living on it for a long time. More than 70 times larger than that huge battleship? Theoretically, it was not difficult to build such a battleship in the weightless universe, but the industrial design and multi-system integration would encounter many unexpected problems. As such, the Federation of the Milky Way hadn't tried to build such a battleship until now." Hearing this, Suzai raised his eyebrows slightly, and Kane Yang remained silent. Yuan Chu and Yushan eyed each other, thinking that it was true that they hadn't thought of it. It was because it was obviously impossible that they hadn't thought of the battleship. Even if such a huge battleship did exist, it would be hard to explain this curve. Kane Yang said while pointing to a spot on the wall. It's not even if, Tseng Ju said with a complicated expression. That battleship does exist. Kane Yang was taken aback a bit, asking, do you have any proof? Tseng Ju said, you should know from Barry Cloud that I've been doing the calculation work on the 857 base over the years, and I've also dealt with the allocation of military resources. You can regard me as an accountant. One year, when I was doing the calculation, I found some problems in the resource plan of the last 100 years. It was obvious that the resources had been lost secretly. Li Chunyang said that they had other uses. I thought that those experimental planets had been taken away. Only now did I understand that those resources should have been transported to the solar system. Kane Yang asked earnestly, how many resources? Tseng Ju said, it's even more than what you've calculated. At this point, He Xian's conjecture seemed to be established. The eye of the solar system sword formation was that huge battleship that no one had ever seen before. Yuan Chu and the others were delighted, but Kane Yang was even more silent and even felt a little dejected. What's wrong? Yushan looked at her and asked softly. Kane Yang said, if the formation eyes a battleship, it won't move along a fixed route like the natural celestial bodies, which can change its direction and speed at any time. In that case, we will never be able to calculate its exact position. More terrifyingly, it means that the Great Grandmaster can adjust the formation by changing the position of the formation eye at any time. If the formation could be changed at will, it meant that the life gate might not always be safe. In other words, regardless of whether Tong Yan's inference was correct or not, there was at least a possibility that the immortals on the surface of Mars could have been killed by the Patriarch. The atmosphere in the room, which had just become relaxed, became solemn again. Let's calculate the formation pivot first, Tong Yin said expressionlessly. The formation pivot was the most important place in a formation, and it must be located in a relatively stable position in the formation. If they could find the formation pivot and the pattern of the formation's operation, they might be able to find the formation eye and break the formation. They didn't need to find the formation pivot of the solar system sword formation because it was hanging there conspicuously. It was the sun. The problem was, since the sun was so huge, which point on the surface of the sun should they calculate? What if the point was deep inside the sun? Of course, this was a problem they had to consider later. The functional relationship between the 2 points must be an uneven but boundless curve. Shun Yunmai's voice rang out again. Nobody knew whether the Great Grandmaster would be crazy enough to change the formation and kill all the people on Mars. Time continued to flow as usual, but there was a sense of urgency. Kane Yang and Tong Yin walked to the wall and wiped off the results of their research for many days and started a new topic. Tseng Ju stood behind them with a solemn expression, giving some advice once in a while. Henan Xian turned around and left the room, walking toward the outside of the base. Hurried footsteps were heard as Yushan caught up with them. He presented a bottle of magic pills with both hands and said gingerly, "This is the last batch of magic pills the sect leader made before his ascension. It's very useful." Henan Xian fell silent for a while. She didn't explain that she was just here to take a look, not to ask for magic pills, nor did she express her gratitude. She just took the bottle. A relieved smile appeared on Yushan's face. "I've hurt you so badly, but why don't I see any hatred in your heart?" Henan Xian asked while looking at her. Yushan said with embarrassment, "Big Brother Yuan Chu and I are not talented enough. We were lucky to ascend. We should have lost the fight against you." Since they should have lost, they wouldn't hate her. Henan Xian asked confusedly, "Since you knew you would lose, why did you fight?" Before Yushan could answer, she thought of Kane Yang's answer. She smiled self-mockingly and said while looking at the room, "That little girl is too much. She spent so many days calculating so many things, but she suddenly wants to overturn everything. But I can't see any disappointment in her heart. What on earth are you little guys thinking? Even if you can't calculate the result, it's still a preliminary preparation. Just like me, no matter how badly injured I am, it's fine as long as I don't die. Yushan said with a smile. As long as senior uncle wakes up and knows we are here, he will definitely come here. Then everything will be settled. Henan Xian realized who Yushan was talking about after thinking for a while. She asked in confusion, "Why do you trust Jing Yang so much?" Yushan said, "Just like how the seniors trust the founding master." Henan Xian said calmly, "The founding master has never been defeated in his life, nor has he made any mistakes." Yushan said confidently, "Senior uncle has never been defeated. Even though he is trapped by the founding master, he is still alive." This was the common view of the Aoyama sect since Taiping and Jingyang. As long as he was alive, he was not defeated. After a moment of silence, Henan Xian turned around and continued walking toward the outside of the base. It was unclear if it was because of her severe injury, but she didn't fly on the cloud. What was even stranger was that she didn't fly back to the mountaintop. "Senior Master, what are you going to do?" Yushan yelled behind her. "I'm going to find that Master Yamai. He's still throwing a tantrum like a little kid at a critical moment, like running away from home." Henan Xian raised the medicine bottle in her right hand and waved it in a carefree manner. The calculations were still going on in the room, and Shun Yunmai's vulgar words could be heard from time to time. Peng Lang, Lu Shui, and the others couldn't bear listening to him anymore. Since they couldn't help, they walked out of the room and sat down on the sandy ground. Yushan sat beside Yuan Chu naturally and hugged her knees, looking like the young girl under the starlight on the cliff of the Shanghai Peak. Su Zai withdrew his gaze after taking a glance at Peng Lang and said, "I didn't expect you to be so powerful." Peng Lang said modestly, "I'm just passable." Su Zai laughed and said, "You are so hypocritical." Thinking of his status in his clan in the north, Peng Lang wondered how he was hypocritical. Everything had to be done in a certain way. Though Jing Jiu had taught Peng Lang the sword work, and the No Mercy sect and Aoyama were close, they were still two different sections. Big Brother Shui is also very powerful, Yushan said reflexively. Suzai shot a glance at Lu Shui and said, "He relies mainly on those magic treasures." Lu Shui didn't get angry, saying, "Young master said that the difference between humans and rocks is that they know how to use things." Suzai sneered. "The problem is, are those things yours?" Lu Shui explained earnestly, "Now that the matter is over, I'll return the streamer to you. Little young sister has poured so much soul fire into it as interest." Yuan Chu retorted, "It's merely borrowing something. Is it worth your nagging for more than 100 years? Did you hear me? It's not like I won't return it to you." Suzai exclaimed angrily, "Is it borrowing? Does Zhao Leo even know how to write the word borrow?" Time elapsed while the two of them talked about the old grudges. It was another dusk on Mars, and a new morning came. One day and one night had elapsed, but the work on the other side hadn't progressed, because Shun Yunmai hadn't stopped swearing. Sitting on the sandy ground, Lu Shui and the others looked at the sky in boredom. Though they hadn't fully recovered from their wounds, it was not a big problem for them. The real problem was in this patch of the sky. After passing the highest mountain up ahead and ascending another 300 meters, they would find the endless sword wheels in the sky over there, as well as the invisible ocean. They hadn't mentioned the dead dog for a while. It was not because they didn't want to or worry about him, but they were a bit scared. The dead dog had guarded the Shangda Peak for many years, so he was very familiar with the sword formation of Aoyama. Moreover, he had absorbed a great deal of fairy energy from the starlight along the way, and his cultivation state had become more profound. As a result, he was able to protect them in the Kuiper Belt and lead them to this path leading to the Life Gate. However, he was searching for the eye of the formation in the sword formation at the moment, so he had to endure the attacks of the sword wills all the time. Even Peng Lang had almost been lost in that patch of empty space, and he had retreated reluctantly. And he had stayed there for so many days. Was he okay? The alarm suddenly rang out in the building of the base. Soon after, another alarm rang out in a building. Lu Shui and Peng Lang disappeared from the original spots, leaving dozens of sword lights behind. Su Zai and the others hurried back as quickly as they could. As they returned to the room, the alarm had already disappeared. The expressions on the faces of Tong Yin and the others were grave. They were using the computing terminal of the robot to deduce the program they had written. Singju was also using his own device to deduce the program a second time. A moment ago, the automatic program had suddenly malfunctioned, giving off 2 alarms. Judging from the data, a celestial body of a great mass was approaching the solar system, and its gravitational force had disturbed the sword formation and their calculations. They couldn't figure out what that celestial body was, and they didn't even know how wide the range of its gravitational force was. What on earth was approaching the solar system? While staring at the data on the wall, Kane Yang suddenly turned to look at the light screen shot out by Singju's bracelet, murmuring, "The formation has started to change." Upon hearing this, the expressions on everyone's faces changed abruptly. The sword formation of the solar system could change at any time. This was the result they had figured out, and it was also the last thing they wanted to see. If the formation was changed, the life gate would not be the life gate anymore, and it might even become the most dangerous dead zone. Mars would still exist, but what about these people who were still on Mars? "Great Grandmaster," Kane Yang said with a pale face. "We have to find a way to stop him as soon as possible." Tong Yin looked at Sungju and said, "It will take some time to change the formation. Let's ask those seniors to come over and try to break the formation together." Sungju smiled bitterly, thinking that she didn't need those people to help her break the formation. She just wanted to take a few more hostages and hope that those people could help her hold on for a while if the sword formation of the solar system started to fall. Before he could say anything, the shabby robot had already run out of the building and arrived at the flat ground in the middle of the ring-shaped base. The robot turned on the loudspeaker of the highest power toward the mountain in the distance and yelled, "Come here quickly. My old man has gone crazy. You're all going to die." The seawater was lapping against the beach not far away, teasing the coconut shells and teasing the monkeys who didn't dare to make a sound because of the bloody moon and the darkness of the day. The seawater in the pond lapped against the bamboo pole lightly, as if to comfort it that it was all right even if it couldn't catch any fish. The great Grandmaster of Aoyama was sitting in a wheelchair, his body slightly askew, his eyes half closed. The wrinkles on his face seemed to have been smoothed out by the sound of the double waves. He suddenly opened his eyes and looked into the depths of a universe. He could feel a massive celestial body approaching the solar system, even disrupting the formation. That celestial body was a little strange. The gravitational disturbance wasn't particularly strong, but the range was very wide. Rujui walked out from the cave abode, and his expression changed slightly as he looked at the changes in the dark sky. The bloody moon hanging low above the sea seemed to be slightly deformed, and there seemed to be a ripple in the sword formation of the solar system. What kind of object could have such a huge impact? "It's here," the great Grandmaster of Aoyama said. Rujui turned to look at him and asked nervously, "Who's here?" The great Grandmaster didn't answer his question. He sat up with some difficulty and reached out to pull out all the fishing rods by the side of the pond. The holes that the fishing rods had pierced into the beach were immediately filled up by the overflowing seawater, and under the illumination of the stars, they looked like mercury. During the childhood of human civilization, mercury was usually used in the tombs of emperors. There was a huge underground space that looked like a mausoleum at the bottom of the sea. Countless black tombstones flashed with blue electric arcs. The electric arcs weren't of the same thickness and looked a little like chains. Or maybe it was sword ropes. Countless sword wills that weren't very sharp, but were extremely calm, were born from the blue electric arcs and zigzagged upwards, passing through the ground and the endless seawater and leaving the atmosphere. Those sword wills were pulled by an invisible force, and like the strings of zither, or like the strings of a sword, they shot towards somewhere in the depths of the solar system. Did the invisible force come from the bloody moon above the sea, or was it something else? Rujui looked at the night sky and felt that the sword formation of the solar system was changing, and his face gradually paled. Those planets were still in their original positions. The starlight in the sky didn't seem to have changed. But something had changed. Life and death were changing. As long as the sword formation of the solar system completed its transformation, no matter who was in the gate of life, they would face the attacks of the endless sword wills. In other words, no matter who came to the solar system now, as long as they landed on Mars, they would die in this sword formation. But what about the immortals on Mars? They couldn't leave the gate of life. Could they only watch as the gate of life became a dead zone and die together with the person who came? Rujui knelt down next to the wheelchair, hugged the founding master's skinny legs, and said with a trembling voice, "I know you've already killed one. Can you not kill another?" The founding master looked at the night sky. Without saying anything, his eyes were calm, extremely emotionless. Rujui felt very cold. It was a gaze that only God could have. In the eyes of God, all living beings were ants. Immortals were also living beings. Why couldn't they die? Zhao Liu pushed the wheelchair to the window at the forefront of the battleship. Outside the window was the sun. The stars in the night sky were all battleships. Some of the battleships were a few kilometers long. Some were even more than 20 kilometers long, and were even larger than asteroids. More than 30,000 battleships were arranged at a safe distance, forming a semicircular surface, like a giant cover, covering the solar system. It was a magnificent sight. Zhao Liu squatted down next to the wheelchair, placed her hand on his knee, and asked, "Shall we begin?" Ada lay on his leg, lightly licking the back of her hand. Jing Jiu was covered with a blanket, his face pale, like a patient who hadn't been here for long. He felt that it was meaningless to do this, but he knew that Zhao Liu wouldn't be satisfied without trying, so he agreed. Chapter 1005. After someone uttered, over 30,000 battleships opened fire one after another. Countless lasers, plasma cannons, and high-energy particle cannons bombarded the solar system. The straight rays of light and the light blue ionization lines looked like countless fine threads, which soon filled the entire space of the universe and illuminated the place. The attacks of these long-range weapons were not as fleeting as they usually were. They were more like the platoons of soldiers in ancient times, firing one round after another without any pause. The furious bombardment lasted for a long time. In the latter half of the battle, hundreds of thousands of multi-phase nuclear bombs, which were rarely used in space battles, were fired into the space. A corner of the dim universe was illuminated continuously. If there were life forms in other galaxies, they might be able to witness this magnificent and spectacular scene after tens of millions of years. It was obvious that the solar system had never been so bright since it was stabilized, and the energy in the space of the galaxy had never been so chaotic. 27 minutes after the standard time, the spectacular firing of the battleships had finally come to an end, and the universe gradually became peaceful. This was the largest energy output in the history of the human civilization in a single unit of time. It was even greater than the time when the Grand Master of the Aoyama used the battleships to form the Aoyama sword formation and blasted the planet into pieces. This time, the number of battleships involved was higher, and they were of a higher level, and the firing time was longer. 12% of the energy storage of over 30,000 battleships had been depleted after one round of firing. According to the data sent back by the detectors at the edge of the solar system, the background temperature of this part of the universe had been raised by 4 degrees Celsius. It was easy to imagine how dreadful the power of the attack was. No ferryman could resist the attack of such a high energy level. Even a giant planet would be torn to pieces by this energy storm. Yet, the universe in front of them remained unchanged. The sun was still like a small white speck hanging in the distance in silence. The childhood home of the human civilization was as peaceful as ever, as if it had not been disturbed in the slightest. Tens of millions of soldiers on the 30,000 battleships were stunned speechless, not daring to believe their eyes. A few minutes later, the calculation result of the central computer came out. The most powerful firing in the history of the human civilization had successfully depleted the energy domain of the sword formation of the solar system by 0.03%. Why did it happen? It was because this was a sword formation with the sun as its energy core and the gravitational force of the planet as its formation intent. The battleships of the Federation of the Milky Way were indeed powerful. Each of those super battleships could wipe out a planet. The fleet of 30,000 battleships was indeed invincible. The problem was that warships would never be so foolish and arrogant as to start a war against the universe itself. In the face of a stellar-level defense system, which was the current formation, the fleet was powerless. If human weapons could destroy stars, why would they need Jingjiao? The story had long since taken a different path. Zhao Liu stood up and looked at the unchanging universe in front of her. Her eyes were slightly cold. She cultivated the killing sword Dao, so she never cared about things like the demeanor of an immortal. Therefore, she had seized the power of the Federation of the Milky Way in advance and made sufficient preparations before waking up Jingjiao and coming to the ancestral planet for the final battle. Leading tens of thousands of warships to sweep across the universe and blast the homeworld into pieces was, of course, much safer than fighting the founding ancestor alone. What she didn't expect was that the founding master had already made preparations and hid the entire solar system. This is indeed the style of the Aoyama sect, hiding in a turtle shell when they can't win. She thought to herself, when Taiping Jinren encountered something he couldn't handle, he would leave in advance cautiously and hide in a place where nobody could find him, like the turtle shell of Emperor Shao. The great ancestor of the Aoyama sect was an old turtle. He would close his eyes and hide in the presence of danger. The continuous bombardment of over 30,000 battleships didn't leave any trace, nor did they move the invisible cutting line by an inch. Nothing happened. The fact shocked tens of millions of officers and soldiers on the battleships. Even the Snow Girl, standing on the battleship and looking at the distant sun, had a more serious expression in her eyes. Huashi was still sleeping soundly in the transparent ice cube, but a faint smile appeared on the corners of her mouth. A painful cough broke out, breaking the silence on the battleship. Zhao Liu turned her head around to look. Jingjiao was leaning against the wheelchair, his face still pale and extremely weak. What an impressive sword formation of Aoyama. Unlike Tong Yin and the others, he didn't have to figure out the truth after entering the deep part of the solar system and encountering the sword wills, nor did he have to do many experiments on the scorching sun battleship like Lu Shui did to find some clues. All he needed to do was take a glance at it to know what was in the universe ahead. The origin of the sword formation of Aoyama was the 4 words left by the founding master of Aoyama for his disciples in the script of sword before his ascension. All in one sword. This was the highest level of the sword work of Aoyama, and the reason why the sword formation of Aoyama could intimidate Chaotian for 30,000 years. This supreme sword work was not like what General Li, Jian Shilai, Ensheng, and the others had comprehended, but the fact that all in one sword could be used as a sword. The founding master had arranged the entire solar system into a sword formation of Aoyama. In other words, he could use the whole solar system as a sword. As for what method the founding master employed to make use of the endless fairy energy of the sun and those planets, it was still unknown. Many years ago, he had used thousands of battleships to set up a sword formation of Aoyama and destroyed that planet. Perhaps it was a rehearsal for this day. In the history of the human civilization, only 2 people had comprehended and mastered such a sword work. They were Jingjiao and the founding master of Aoyama. Jingjiao suddenly wanted to stroke the cat, but he remembered that he couldn't move his hands. Ada rubbed his thumb against Jingjiao's hand obediently. Along with a flash of green light, Qing flew out from somewhere. She reported the latest calculation result of the central computer without even looking at Jingjiao. If nothing was done and the energy of the sword formation of the solar system escaped and disintegrated on its own, It would take about 940,000 years. Looking at the little girl on Zhao Liu's shoulder, Jingjiu didn't say anything while smiling faintly. Though Qing didn't look at Jingjiu, she could sense Jingjiu's gaze, feeling uneasy. Flapping her transparent wings twice, she continued, I suggest that we leave this place alone and bring the fleet back to the Federation of the Milky Way. After that, we should reform the social structure of the Federation of the Milky Way and try our best to promote the development of science and technology so that the local civilization can reach the fixed state as soon as possible. If the human civilization could reach the fixed state, it would be easy to deal with this sword formation with the sun as its core. How many years will it take? Asked Zhao Liu. Qing lifted her small face proudly and said, After I've merged with the central computer, the speed will be very fast. It will take at least 3,000 years. Remember to pull the weeds on my grave for me, said Jingjiu. Qing turned her head around and sneered at Jingjiu, saying, You're going to die. Your body is an important weapon for us to deal with the sea of dark matter, so it's impossible for you to be buried underground. Did it mean that she wanted him to die without a burial place? Jingjiu didn't expect that the little girl's resentment toward him hadn't disappeared after 500 years. Zhao Liu shot a glance at Qing. Qing flew onto Jingjiu's shoulder reluctantly. Nobody knew that this act of comforting Jingjiu under duress was in fact a way to transmit information. Zhao Liu looked at Jingjiu in silence, waiting for him to make a decision. The expression on Jingjiu's face didn't change. He uttered, to express his agreement. If the snow girl knew that they didn't have the thing that could control her, she would turn around and leave with Huaxi. They would go to the main administrative planet and other computing planets to look for it. She wouldn't pay any attention to the sword formation of the solar system in front of them, nor would she care about their lives. Zhao Liu didn't say anything, her eyelids drooping slightly. Qing looked back and forth between the two of them, thinking fearfully that the people of the Aoyama sect were all so unfeeling. Jingjiu turned to ask, Any news about Shi Sui? The Scorching Sun battleship has been keeping an eye on him, but he disappeared after he and Sun Ju entered the solar system, and all communication has been cut off, said Zhao Liu. In some aspects, this sword formation of the solar system was similar to the black hole. The fleet brought by Zhao Liu was indeed invincible in the world, and the combination of Jingjiu and the Snow Girl was also invincible in the world, but they couldn't do anything to this sword formation. According to the calculation result of the central computer, it's very likely that they are still alive. Seeing Jingjiu's pale face, Qing thought that he was worried about those juniors who were lost in the sword formation, feeling a bit sorry for him. As long as Shinaoyama wants to leave, he will definitely leave the life gate open, she said comfortingly. Zhao Liu suggested while looking at Jingjiu, Let's keep watching for a while longer. This sword formation of the solar system could be understood as a prison. The grandmasters of Aoyama isolated themselves from the outside world, so they couldn't affect the outside world. If this were merely a war, they could turn around and leave, leaving the matter here behind. However, Jingjiu was awakened forcibly by Zhao Liu, so he couldn't hold on for too long. Even if he didn't have a grave after his death and didn't have to worry about the grass growing on the grave, he still didn't want to. Ada thought, back when you were on the Shinma Peak, you named the sword style, you created the Nine Death sword style. It's really inauspicious. A few gazes fell on the wheelchair, waiting for Jingjiu's decision. Jingjiu said, He set up this formation in order to wait for me to break it. As such, I have no choice but to give it a try. Ada's blood was boiling when he heard what Jingjiu said, and the expression in Qing Er's eyes became much gentler. Only Zhao Liu had a bad premonition. It was a beautiful description to be calm when facing a major event. As far as Jingjiu was concerned, the more important an event was, the more decisive his decision would be, and the fewer words he would say. He didn't say anything when he ascended for the first time. When he ascended for the second time, he only said one word, I'm leaving. But today, he had said a whole sentence, and he had even stated the reason for his departure. No matter what, now that he had made a decision, Zhao Liu would carry out his decision without any hesitation. She pushed the wheelchair to the window. Ada floated up from the blanket, hurriedly hooked the sword rope around Jingjiu's neck, and hugged him tightly. Jingjiu knew that Ada was trying to express some beautiful feelings, but he couldn't respond with his actions. So he just smiled. All the battleships were retreating slowly, in order to avoid causing too much disturbance to the sword formation and affecting the process of entering the formation. Only the Scorching Sun battleship stayed outside the Kuiper Belt and continued to observe. Looking at Jingjiu sitting in the wheelchair on the light screen, the captain of the Scorching Sun battleship, Jiang Zhixing, and the rest of the advisory officers raised their hands to salute Jingjiu slowly, showing a complicated emotion. The stars in the sky had faded away, and the universe grew darker and quieter, but it couldn't bring them a sense of security. Looking at the shapeless sword formation in the void, Zhao Liu was calculating the way to enter the formation. Her sword work was very high and had reached the level of the all-in-one sword, on the same level as General Li, Jianxilai, and Enxing. Of course, Jingjiu's sword work was more advanced. Normally, he should be the one calculating the way to enter the sword formation and the way to the life gate. However, she knew better than anybody else that he didn't learn the inherited heaven sword well, and he was very weak at the moment. As such, she didn't dare count on him. All of a sudden, a white light flew over from the side. It was the Snow Girl. Though there was no air here, her red cloak was fluttering vigorously. The transparent ice cube was pulled by an invisible force, following behind her. It was unclear when Cold Cicada had left Ada, but it was hovering above her head. It opened its tentacles against the sunlight, trembling slightly. A crack suddenly appeared in the void ahead, hiding the figure of the Snow Girl. Does she really know how to use the inherited heaven sword? Zhao Liu exclaimed with a slightly surprised expression. Back when the fairy lady Bai Run came to the human world, she was killed by 10,000 swords. Many people were guessing why the destroyed sword formation of Aoyama was reborn. They finally had the most accurate answer. I taught her, said Jingjiu. His voice was very weak, but his eyes were bright, showing a hint of complacency. He had been the teacher of the Snow Girl at the 3000 Nunnery in Dayuan City. Though it was only for a few seconds, it was still something to be proud of. Zhao Liu didn't say anything more, pushing the wheelchair forward. Standing on her shoulder, Qing'er remarked, "It feels a bit strange to push a wheelchair into space." Ada meowed once, indicating that it was like taking off one's pants to fart. The wheelchair entered the void. The Snow Girl was right. They had entered the path leading to the life gate of the sword formation of the solar system. Of course, it could also lead to death ahead. Mount Olympus was the highest mountain in the solar system. Even though it was much shorter after the collision between Chunya and Lu Shui, it was still the tallest mountain in the solar system. The robots shouted for a long time on the northwest plateau, but they couldn't summon a single ferryman. Shen Yunmai was so angry that he left the base with the others and went back to the top of the mountain. If the mountain didn't come to them, they would come to the mountain. If they were so capable, they could move the mountain away, or they could move the mountain away from it. The immortals of the previous generations had no reason to give up the top of the mountain, so they looked at them cautiously. Tong Yin told them her conjecture in the simplest and most understandable way. None of the immortals believed Lu Shui's words the last time, and Tseng Ju and the fairy nun merely went there to take a look. But now all the immortals could vaguely sense that the sword formation of the solar system was slowly changing, so their mentality had changed as well. If the Patriarch was really changing the formation, the positions of the planets on the handle of the formation would change. Mars was originally the gate of life, but it would soon become the ruins of death. The moment the formation changed, countless sword wills would rush out from the solar system. Even if the immortals present could hold on for a while, how long could they do so? As for leaving Mars to find the gate of life, even Peng Lang had returned without success, so they had no confidence. This meant that if they couldn't stop the formation from changing, all of them would be dead. But even at this moment, not everyone believed Tong Yan's conjecture. The god-slaying master, the lord of the East Purple Chi, and Mr. Dong were sitting on the cliff rocks with indifferent expressions. It was obvious that they would not participate in this matter. The two black-robed, demonic immortals were guarding Chun Ye's broken body on the incense burner table, their faces gloomy, but one of them still looked happy. It was a funny scene. Goose was said in a cold voice. The patriarch must have changed the formation because something unexpected happened. Why would it be against us? The fairy swordsman In Sheng stood by the distant cliff's edge in silence, looking at the distant blue planet in the sky. It seemed that he was trying to guess what the patriarch had in mind. I'll set up a formation. If you're willing to memorize it, you can do so. It will help you stay alive for a while. The robot clapped his hands forcefully twice, saying, "We don't have much time. Hurry up." In the end, only 3 immortals were willing to study the method of breaking the formation with them. Sung Jusha glanced at Tong Yan. Tong Yan's childish face displayed the appropriate amount of gratitude and joy. No one could find anything wrong with her expression. Nobody noticed that Su Zai and Yuan Chu were observing the surroundings while listening to Shun Yunmai's explanation of the formation, preparing to let these immortals of the previous generation stand in the front when the sword formation fell. This one should be the best. Su Zai fixed his gaze on the incense burner table and the broken body of Chunya. "It's very sturdy," he said to Yuan Chu through his spiritual awareness. Yuan Chu inhaled deeply, thinking that Su Zai was indeed the last devil of the deviant sects in Chaotian. He didn't even spare the corpse of a dying man. "It's too cruel." Jingjiu sent back a spiritual awareness. With a sneer, Su Zai said, "Lu Shi Sui is the golden body of the Guochang Temple. Do you intend to lift him above your head?" Chapter 1006. As they were thinking about these sinister things, Tong Yin, Kane Yang, Zheng Zhu, and the other immortals of the previous generation had started to calculate again. Countless numbers and complicated equations were carved on the cliff wall by the flying swords. They stood in the air, analyzing the cliff wall and taking out their terminals to calculate from time to time. There were many ways to solve the problem. At least in the beginning and the middle stage, nobody could be sure that they were right before the correct answer was found. Therefore, the discussion could easily turn into an argument. They talked faster and faster, and their voices became louder and louder. It was not limited to their respective camps. It was more like a tangled fight. The robot sat by the cliff wall, swinging its legs like Lu Ci in the books, and joined the argument with dirty words from time to time. Kane Yang couldn't stand it anymore, saying, "Can't you be quiet?" Shun Yunmai's voice came from the robot. "Why? Don't you think I'm so naive and adorable?" Kane Yang retorted, "You've knocked off the cliff wall. What if the numbers are mixed up?" Shun Yunmai said mockingly, "Only those old guys and you country bumpkins would write the numbers on the wall." Kane Yang, Tong Yin, and the others exchanged a glance and decided to ignore him. The heated argument in the sky outside the cliff wall disappeared. They started to communicate with the spiritual awareness, which was indeed faster than communicating with words. Shin Yunmai yelled, "I'm the one who reminded you. How can you leave me out of the game?" The sword formation of the solar system might be changing. Mars might become a dead land. Of course, it was not fun to figure out a way to solve the formation. It was an intense work. As the calculation went on, they were getting closer to the answer. The atmosphere became more and more intense. An immortal of the previous generation kept scratching his head. His hair was disheveled, and his face was dirty. He stared at the numbers on the cliff wall absent-mindedly, mumbling to himself like a doctoral student who couldn't graduate for many years. "Uncle and I, can you lower your voice when you talk to yourself? It's a bit noisy," Shin Yunmai said to him. This immortal by the surname of Ni was the governor of Yuehua City before he started his cultivation. He was imprisoned because of a common story in the officialdom and was tortured to the point that he lost his mind. Who would have thought that on the day he was about to be executed, he would actually come to a sudden realization? In the autumn rain, He broke out of prison and joined a secluded sect. More than 100 years later, he achieved great success in his state. He heard that the previous emperor had decided to abdicate the throne and become a free and unfettered retired emperor. Without any hesitation, he broke out of the isolation and ignored the warnings of the cultivation sects behind the imperial court. He barged into the imperial city and cut off the emperor's head in front of 30,000 imperial guards. After 1,000 years, he finally ascended to become an immortal and came to this world. Through the later ascenders, he learned that his family's hidden sect had long disappeared in the long river of history. However, the memories in the imperial prison seemed to be tormenting him, and he would fall into this slightly abnormal state from time to time. He looked at Shen Yunmai and said with a sneer, "I admit that your talent and wisdom are above mine, but now I only have a head left." Shen Yunmai sneered, "If I don't rely on my brain to solve the problem, do I rely on my buttocks like you do?" Immortal and I was enraged. "You suggested using the iterative threading technique, but what organ did you come up with? Do you have organs? You don't even have a buttocks." Shen Yunmai couldn't tolerate others questioning his wisdom and body, so he said coldly, "Only an idiot would try to switch from algebraic geometry to number theory." Thinking of his cultivation career after coming to this world, the immortal Ni's face turned pale, and he was speechless for a moment. The other immortal couldn't help but say, "Yunmai, you said that you developed the iterative threading technique 5 days ago. Well, let's not talk about whether there will be any problems if it's done in a hurry. Moreover, it's impossible to verify your method because we don't have a computing core with enough power to run the program." Shen Yunmai designed a brand new mathematical tool 5 days ago, hoping to confirm the core of the solar system sword formation through verification. However, as the immortal and I said, it required a great deal of calculation. Unless they could connect to the charter network on Mars and use the central computer, they couldn't calculate the result. However, they were in the solar system's sword formation, so they couldn't contact the outside world. Shen Yunmai said with a sneer, "If it were in the past, I would have figured it out by myself." Tong Yin said calmly, "But you can't do it now." Shen Yunmai's perfect body was destroyed in the explosion of the nuclear power furnace, along with the important special mathematical processing core. The robot raised its mechanical arm and gave the middle finger. "I think we should use the pure yang transformation." Cain Yang's uncertain voice rang out in the sky outside the cliff. The immortals in the sky and Shen Yunmai, sitting by the cliff's edge, fell silent for a moment, and then burst out laughing. Even the fairy swordsman In Sheng and the others on the cliff's edge shot a glance in that direction. "Where did you see the pure yang transformation?" asked Shen Yunmai. Cain Yang said, "Didn't you give us a lesson on the battleship?" Shen Yunmai said, "I'm sure that I didn't mention the pure yang transformation, and it wasn't in the data instilled." Cain Yang said, "I saw it when I was studying by myself in the database of the battleship." Sung Ju said with a faint smile, "It's not easy for you to know it, but it's indeed not feasible." Many years ago, a paper was suddenly written on the blackboard of the mathematics department of the University of Stargate. The title of the paper was The Pure Yang Transformation. It was a novel idea, and the method was ingenious. This paper had a novel idea, and its method was ingenious. If it was proved, it would be able to solve a few unsolved problems in mathematics, causing a great shock in a mathematics circle. However, as the research went deeper, many mathematicians found that this paper had a serious problem, and it was impossible to solve it under the current conditions. After some discussion, the major mathematics journals announced the withdrawal of the paper. The paper was returned to the library, and nobody paid attention to it anymore. It wasn't until a long time later that few people knew that this paper was written by General Li. After he left Chaotian, he was arranged by the Grand Master to study at the University of Stargate. He had written this paper after studying for half a year. The immortals of the previous generations knew about it, but they all regarded it as a joke. Yet, nobody dared mention it in front of General Li, save for Shen Yunmai. Kane Yang said that she would use the viewpoint of this famous paper to solve the problem, which drew a lot of mockery. But I think it might work, Kane Yang said softly, feeling even less confident. Tong Yin asked while looking at her with an encouraging expression, "Do you have a way to prove it?" Kane Yang shook her head helplessly, saying, "It's just my intuition. It's the same as the intuition I had when I found out that the eye of the formation was a battleship." As I said, the word intuition is often used to cover up the absurdity and awkwardness. The aged voice of the godly battering master drifted over from the cliff. Like the two devil immortals in black and others, he didn't believe that the Grandmaster would change the formation to kill someone, but he was curious about the discussion outside the cliff. Intuition is a method created by human beings to compensate for the lack of calculating ability. Your calculating ability is terrible, so intuition is the only tool you should hold on to. What Kane Yang said is correct. To solve this problem, we should use the pure Yang transformation. A voice drifted down from the sky, sounding lethargic. It seemed that the speaker hadn't slept for many days, or that he had slept on the sickbed for too many days. The godly battering master sneered. "It's ridiculous. Who's talking nonsense?" A wheelchair fell down from the sky. Jing Jiao sat in the wheelchair, covered with a blanket which was slightly arched. Zhao Liu pushed the wheelchair, her short hair slightly disheveled. Seeing this scene, everyone was shocked, and it took them a while to react. Several magic treasures shot up into the sky, and were then pushed back by the sword while above the atmosphere, illuminating the cliff. The immortals of the previous generation were extremely vigilant, as if they were facing a great enemy. Sword Immortal En Sheng stared at Jing Jiao in the wheelchair, sword light flashing in the depths of his eyes, full of fighting intent. His injuries hadn't healed yet, but suddenly encountering the most powerful swordsman, he still had a strong desire to use his sword. The godly battering master slowly stood up from the cliff, holding the broken drum in his hand, and said expressionlessly, "So it's immortal Jingyang." The two devil immortals in black separated like ghosts, landing on both sides of the wheelchair. Jing Jiao didn't take a look at these immortals, because it was tiring to turn his head. Looking at Kane Yang outside the cliff, he continued, "When we played chess back then, I could tell that your intuition is stronger than Tong Yan's. Don't doubt it so easily." Kane Yang was thrilled to see her master's fairy face again after so many years. She didn't care about the conversion of pure Yang anymore, and knelt down in the air to bow to him. Tong Yan raised her eyebrows, but didn't say anything. Lu Shui and the others were pleasantly surprised, flying to the front of the wheelchair and bowing to him, addressing him as young master, master, senior uncle, immortal, and so on, flew to the edge of the cliff, until they were interrupted by a lazy voice. "Oh, Old Nine, you're still alive. That's great." Jing Jiao almost thought that Zhuo Ruzhui was here, but he recognized it was Shun Yunmai's voice. "It's great that you're still alive," he said with a smile. Seeing this, Lu Shui and the others were surprised, thinking that Shun Yunmai didn't lie, and the two of them had a good relationship. In the next moment, they realized something was wrong. Yuan Chu's face was as cold as ice, as if he had returned to the sword justice of Aoyama. "How dare you? How dare you be rude to the immortal? What are you looking at? Why are you shouting?" The robot stood up, looked down at Yuan Chu, and said mockingly, "According to seniority, which one of you is higher than me? He and I are of the same generation, and that's because of our friendship. Did I ask you to kneel down? Who's the rude one?" What he said was true. He was the descendant and heir of the Grandmaster of Aoyama. So according to seniority, he was the real second-generation ancestor. Lu Shui and the others exchanged a look and stopped talking about this topic as if they had a tacit understanding. "Are you going to catch up now? Aren't you looking down on us old fellows too much?" The first master raised the small broken drum tied to his wrist, looked at Jing Jiao, and said expressionlessly, "Even if the ship is broken, there are still dozens of tons of alloy. The broken drum can make a few sounds. Do you want to hear it?" The two black-robed, demonic immortals reached out their right hands to the wheelchair. Their hands were pale, but they had completely different auras, vaguely connected. East Rising Purple Chi and Mr. Dong also stood up with difficulty and took out the most powerful magic weapons that they didn't have time to use during the battle in the canyon. The sword immortal In Sheng's hand fell on the hilt of his sword. During the battle with Peng Lang, he stabbed his sword into the cliff wall, so it didn't suffer any damage. The six immortals of the previous generation surrounded the wheelchair and those people. Was the temporary peace on Mars going to be broken again? I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. Tortoise chanting scriptures. Shin Yunmai's annoying voice rang out again. This was his reply to the first master's words. The first master looked angry, and he was about to beat the small drum. Suddenly, a chubby little hand reached out from under his arm and took the drum away. It was like a child who saw a toy in the night market, a bit unreasonable, but also a bit adorable. The first master seemed to be frozen. He was in a trance at the moment. The drum was the first master's magic treasure that he had carried with him for 1,000 years. Peng Lang couldn't take it away, even though he had broken it with his sword, and it still possessed a powerful magic power. How could it be taken away so easily? When did the rope of the drum break? And how did it break? The expression on the sword immortal In Sheng's face turned grave. He looked even more grave than when he was facing Peng Lang and Jingjiu in the wheelchair. He was about to strike with the hilt of his sword with the fearless temperament unique to the No Mercy sect. But he didn't get what he wanted. It was because the space between the sword and the sheath was frozen. A small figure walked past him. Everybody looked in the direction of the figure. It was a little girl with hair as white as snow. The little girl's face was very round and white. The pupils of her eyes were very dark and deep. She walked toward the wheelchair by the cliff with the small drum in her hand. Chapter 1007. The air on and outside the cliff seemed to have frozen. This was not a description, nor was it a projection of people's mood. It was the change brought about by the sudden drop in temperature. At this moment, the ferrymen felt as if they were facing a formidable enemy, as if they were looking into an abyss. As the little girl got closer and closer, the hands of the two ferrymen in black began to tremble. Nobody had seen the snow girl before, but everybody knew her and could recognize her easily. She reached out her hand and took away the drum of the godly master. She froze the sword of the fairy swordsman, In Sheng, as she passed by. Although both of them were heavily injured, none of them could have done it. Yes, no one could do this. The Grand Master of Aoyama couldn't. Jingjiu couldn't either. Only she could. She had been the true ruler of Chaotian since the ancient times. Facing a formidable enemy, but who dared oppose the Snow Girl? East Rising Purple Chi and Mr. Dong had just employed their magic treasures, but they didn't even have the courage to take them back. The godly master looked at his empty hand and sat back on the cliff, rocked silently. In Sheng raised his sword and looked at it carefully, trying to figure out what those cold particles were and why they had such a powerful force. Sung Ju sighed and bowed to the Snow Girl, saying, "Greetings, Your Majesty." The rest of the ferrymen of the previous generations and Lu Shui also bowed to the Snow Girl. "Greetings, Queen. Greetings, Queen. Greetings, Master Snow Girl." The different forms of address represented the attitude of the cultivation circle in Chaotian at different times, but they all showed the same reverence. Only one form of address was different, which shocked everybody present. Peng Lang bowed to the ground to the Snow Girl, saying in a trembling voice, "Greetings, mother-in-law." The Snow Girl looked at him and rolled her eyes. The ferrymen were already shocked by the appearance of the Queen of the Snowy Kingdom and her appearance, and now they were even more shocked. Peng Lang was her son-in-law. The Queen could roll her eyes? Jingjiu, who was the most familiar with the Snow Girl, had rarely seen her in such a human manner, so he couldn't help but worry that she would do something to Peng Lang. Fortunately, nothing happened. Peng Lang naturally stood behind Shui Jie. People's gazes were attracted by him. Only then did they see the transparent block of ice that seemed to be pulled by a string and was floating forward about half a foot above the ground. They also saw Huashi in the ice. Shock was really like the wealth of the rich. It was also like the snow during an avalanche. Once it was there, it would be endless and there would be more and more of it. The immortals all knew what had happened in the Jiale passage and knew who was inside this little girl's body. The priestess was the inheritor of the ancient civilization and also the symbol of the current civilization. With Zhengju in the lead, everyone bowed their heads to the little girl in the ice to show their respect. You know how to bow to this person, but you don't have the courage to save her. How hypocritical. The person who spoke was the almost forgotten Chenya. Because only half of his body was left, his voice was intermittent and full of air, with a sense of futile anger. He was truly on his last breath. He had intended to hold on until the moment when the great Grandmaster used the sword formation of the solar system to change the fate of the humans. However, when he saw the pitiful appearance of the others in front of the Shueji, especially when the red cloak on the Shueji reminded him of General Li, he couldn't hold back his anger anymore. He yelled sternly, "You all keep quiet out of fear in front of this monster of the Snowy Kingdom. I feel ashamed for you all," Shun Yunmai said earnestly while looking at the incense burner table. "If the Emperor wants to take a look at you, I'll admit defeat." The Shueji, of course, wouldn't take a look at Chenya. She didn't care about the beings she couldn't defeat, like the black hole, and she didn't care about those who could never reach her level. Yet, she didn't like to listen to such nonsense. The bough was flying with the wind. Cold cicada landed on top of Chenya's head. Chenya shut up instantly, frozen into an ice block. He was still a half statue, but he had become an ice sculpture now. The Shueji had already walked to a place not far from the wheelchair. The last of Chenya's energy turned into an icy fog, dissipating in the air. The two demon immortals in black exchanged a glance. Unexpectedly, they launched an attack on the Shueji. Their seemingly timid and trembling hands exuded two completely different energies. They connected in the air and formed a turbulence, shrouding the Shueji. The scene at the moment resembled the white stone in the middle of the river. No matter how turbulent the river water was and how powerful it was, the white stone couldn't be shaken. As Shun Yunmai had said, the white stone didn't even take a look at the river water. Whoosh! The river water suddenly dispersed. They weaved into a whirlpool of turbulence. The pessimistic demon immortal in black, Guzwa, disappeared from his original spot. He turned into a flash of white light and disappeared on the surface of Mars 100 miles away. The fight between the immortals was simple and violent, but it was also troublesome. It took more time to get knocked away and come back than during the fight. As for why the demon immortal in black turned into a flash of white light, the pieces of black cloth fluttering in the air among the cliffs was the reason. The Shueji ignored the other demon immortal in black and kept walking toward the wheelchair. The pair of demon immortals in black used the double Dao combination method, which was quite interesting. But there was only one person left, and he wasn't qualified to make her stop. In the next moment, she suddenly stopped and turned her head to look to the side. The demon immortal had returned to his original spot. He had put on a black cloth again, but his hair was a little messy, and his face was a little pale. If the other demon immortal in black had not moved, people would have thought that he had used the form displacement transposition. What was going on? Even a super mother nest like the Virgin could not withstand a head-on blow from the Shueji. Why did the demon immortal in black seem to be unharmed? And why did he return to his original spot so quickly? The Shueji's black eyes rolled slightly, showing some interest. Boom! The demon immortal in black, who had just returned, was knocked away again. In the next moment, he came back. Another boom. He was knocked away again. In a very short period of about 10 breaths, the demon immortal in black named Guzwa was knocked away 5 times by the Shueji. Miraculously, he didn't die, but he couldn't form the turbulence of the Tao law with his brother again. His body had been destroyed beyond recognition, and he looked extremely miserable. People could finally tell the identity of the demon immortal brothers in black. The Shueji's eyes grew brighter and brighter. It was not because she had encountered a powerful foe, but because she had encountered an interesting event. "I'd like to see how many pieces of black cloth you have with you." She didn't believe he had more than Jing Jio's blue tracksuit. "Stop fighting." Guzwa covered his badly deformed face with one hand and said while raising the other, "I admit defeat. I can't beat him." Guyu said seriously from 100 feet away, "We haven't fought yet. How can you admit defeat?" Guzwa said sorrowfully, "It's only a fight if you can hit the opponent. We're just being beaten. Besides, you're not the one being beaten." The Shuejie looked at the two brothers with her head tilted and uttered a cry. Everybody understood what she meant. "What kind of monsters are you?" "We're not monsters," said Jingjio. "They're the same person." Many people knew that this pair of demon immortals in black was the foreshadowing left by the Grandmaster of Aoyama in Chaotian, but nobody knew what the foreshadowing meant. It turned out that they were the same person, but they were divided into two souls by the Grandmaster, and then they became a pair of twin brothers after being nurtured by the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. This pair of demon immortals in black had the same soul and body, which was why they were both happy and sad at the same time. When they attacked together, they would be more powerful. The advantage was that their souls would only be destroyed if they were killed at the same time. They at the same time referred to the absolute same time. Nobody knew what method the Grandmaster had employed, not even the two of them. Yet, the Grandmaster had started experimenting on the soul a great many years ago, which reminded the people of the deduction made by Tong Yin, and they fell silent. Suzai said gloomily, "I thought it was evil enough that I was a demon fetus, and you two are the seniors." Hearing what Jingjio said, the Shuejie grew more interested. She reached out her two round hands and grabbed the pair of demon immortals in black. She couldn't kill them no matter how far she hit them, so she didn't hit them too far away to avoid trouble. "It's meaningless," Guyu said seriously while looking at her optimistically. "You can't kill me anyway." The Shuejie showed a pleased smile in her eyes. "Huh." The two demon immortals in black bumped into each other heavily, but they couldn't bounce back due to the suppression of her power. They kept pressing forward. "What is your majesty going to do?" Yushan asked curiously, his eyes wide open. King Yang said uncertainly, "Is it the experiment I saw in class a few days ago?" There was a famous experiment in physics. Two polished and smooth metal blocks were pressed together by a great force. As long as enough time passed, the molecules in the two metal blocks would move irregularly and fill in the gaps between the molecules of the other metal block. As a result, the two metal blocks would merge together. It seemed that the Shuejie was going to do this. Guzwa and Guyu leaned against each other, their clothes sticking closely to their bodies, revealing their distinct lines. It seemed as if a huge, invisible hand was holding them tightly, and they couldn't get away. The right side of Guzwa's face was pressed against the left side of Guyu's face, and their skins seemed to be connected. The experiment would take a long time, but how could the Shuejie have such a powerful force in the lab? If the process continued, their flesh and blood, and even their immortal bones would be pressed together by this terrifying force. What was even more unbelievable was that the people could vaguely see the clear light emitted from the bodies of the two demon immortals in black, showing signs of merging. Could it be that the Shuejie was going to fuse the two souls of the first master into one again? If she could do it, when the bodies and souls of the demon immortals in black became one, they would be killed. The half of Guyu's face showed no sign of fear. He looked at the sky and said indifferently, "It doesn't matter. You're going to die anyway." The half of Guzwa's face was full of bewilderment. He looked at the Shuejie and said, "Big brother, we're going to die." Seeing that the demon immortals in black were about to be crushed into minced meat, and it would be difficult to tell them apart, Xingju couldn't bear it anymore. He took a step forward and was about to plead with the Shuejie. All of a sudden, the ground started shaking violently. It came without any warning. Even he almost missed his step. The shaking disappeared in a flash, but it remained in everyone's heart. This was definitely not an earthquake, but a more terrifying force that came from deep space. The people looked up at the night sky and vaguely felt that the shapeless sword formation seemed to have lowered a certain distance and was closer to the ground. In the extreme depths of the night sky, a huge gaseous planet was slowly changing its position. The solar system's sword formation was changing, slowly pressing down toward the surface of Mars. It was as if the Shwe was going to press the demon immortals in black together. A tense atmosphere enveloped the mountaintop. Until now, the people still hadn't figured out the position of the formation's eye. They couldn't break the formation. Were they going to watch the formation fall? Jingjio looked at the slowly descending sky, and his pale face showed an expression of understanding. He said, "So it was waiting for us." Since the first master of Aoyama had the ability to change the formation, why didn't he try to kill Tong Yin and the others on Mars? Because he was waiting for the arrival of Jingjio and the Shwe. When Jingjio and the Shwe entered the solar system sword formation and landed on Mars, he would start to change the formation and turn this life gate into a dead end. This was a very simple plan, but it was very difficult to solve. Countless sword wheels, like tiny shooting stars, began to appear outside the atmosphere, and the space was vaguely deformed. The solar system sword formation finally showed its true power. The sky descended slowly, and it was only 190 meters away from the ground. What should they do next? Should they leave Mars at the risk of drifting endlessly in the sword formation and eventually being killed by the sword wheels? Or should they gather the power of all the immortals and fight head-on? The Shwe released her hands and threw the demon immortals in black to the ground. The bodies of the demon immortals in black were tangled together. Their clothes were torn, and they looked like two pieces of rags that had been treated as garbage. The Shwe looked at the sky and punched. Countless white lights with snowflakes gushed out of her small fist and landed on the invisible void boundary with unimaginable power. With a loud boom, the surface of Mars shook violently again. The gravel on the ground jumped up, forming a foggy scene. Thousands of traces of ice spread out from the place where the punch landed, like a spider web. The fist that could shatter the void could also freeze the space. The sky, which was falling toward the surface of Mars, slowly stopped on the spot with a cracking sound, unable to move any further. I like the title of this chapter very much, but it's not really suitable except for shocking people. It's most suitable to be used when the Shwe dies. The problem is that the path toward heaven is a comedy, and the Shwe will never die. I didn't have many opportunities to use this name, so I put it on today. Chapter 1008. Shwe actually used her little fist to stop the falling sky. All the immortals were stupefied by this scene. Only now did they realize just how powerful and terrifying the Queen of Snowy Empire had become. Peng Lang walked to the back of the Snow Girl, holding the hilt of his sword in his right hand. He looked at the god-slaying master, the fairy of sword and shung, and the others calmly and vigilantly. At such a critical moment, the Snow Girl had to contend with the sword formation of the solar system. Anyone who dared to take advantage of the situation to harm her would face the toughest and craziest sword attack. Jingjio glanced at the Snow Girl and then at the frozen sky, his spiritual awareness wriggling slightly. His divine sense moved slightly, and a small tornado appeared on the ground, rolling up some grains of sand into the air. Then, the grains of sand fell slowly from the bottom of the tornado, like an hourglass. "There's still so much time," he said. Looking at the number of grains of sand and the speed at which they fell, Tong Yin said after a brief calculation, "The standard time is 71 hours. Shin Yunmai also looked at the grains of sand and said, "For minutes." This meant that the Snow Girl wouldn't be able to stop the falling sky from falling after 71 hours and 4 minutes. It was not that her magic could only hold on until that moment, but the sword formation of the solar system would complete its final transformation and swallow Mars. The final process was a transformation of heaven and earth, which couldn't be changed by human beings, even though the Snow Girl was very strong. So, Should they leave in advance? Would they encounter more dangers if they left Mars? Many people fixed their eyes on the wheelchair, waiting for Jing Jiu's judgment, including the fairy outside the cliff. As for the fairy and I, she was still obsessed with the mathematical problems on the cliff wall, so she didn't notice what was happening. Jing Jiu said softly, "Just wait here." "Wait for what?" The fairy of sword Unxing asked while staring into his eyes. Jing Jiu didn't answer this question. Zhao Liu pushed the wheelchair to the sky outside the cliff wall. Looking at the numbers, curves, and equations on the cliff wall, he said softly, "This problem is interesting." He looked pale and weak at the moment, leaning against the wheelchair like a patient who didn't have many days to live. The crowd knew that it was because of the inherited heaven sword. Under such circumstances, it was quite remarkable that he could still maintain his consciousness. Even so, everyone still placed their hopes on him. Previously, Lu Shui and the others had already expressed this idea. As long as he was here, everything could be solved. There's nothing wrong with the pure yang conversion, and there's nothing wrong with your train of thought. You've done a lot of right things these past few days. Jing Jiu looked at Kane Yang and said softly. He was quite appreciative and gratified. Kane Yang smiled shyly. Shun Yunmai protested. "Obviously, Tong Yin and I have contributed the most." Immortal and I was startled awake by the argument and had a slightly perplexed expression as she thought to herself, "Did I not do anything?" Sung Ju walked to the edge of the cliff, looked at Jing Jiu in the wheelchair, and said seriously, "Zhenren, please." Kane Yang came to the side of the wheelchair and reported to Jing Jiu all the data they had observed and calculated these days, including a few ideas that had been rejected. Jing Jiu thought for a while and began to solve the problem softly. Kane Yang took out a bronze mirror and started to record her teacher's words attentively. As her delicate fingertips moved on the surface of the bronze mirror, the stone powder on the cliff wall flew up, showing the numbers and symbols one after another. Seeing this scene, Zhao Liu suddenly wondered what Ran Handong would think if she found out that her position as secretary had been taken away by someone else. It was unclear what Ran Handong would think, but Seng Ju and the others had a peculiar feeling when they saw the numbers and symbols on the cliff wall. The immortal Inai murmured to herself, "So this is how it works. I didn't expect it to work this way." The immortals on the cliff were stunned as well. The master of the Eastern Purple Chi remarked with a grave expression, "This guy is so knowledgeable." These immortals had all gone through systematic learning after they ascended to the Federation of the Milky Way, so they could understand how remarkable the mathematical methods Jing Jiu had employed were. Sitting by the cliff's edge, the robot remarked in a mocking tone, "Capable people like us can do anything. Aren't you used to it?" Based on the hard thinking of Tong Yin and the others in the last few days, Jing Jiu had soon come up with a plan to crack the sword formation of the solar system. All that was left was the troublesome process of checking the calculation. Even though this plan was not like Shun Yunmai's plan, which required the computing core of the central computer, it also required a very advanced mathematical terminal. Where could they find such a terminal on the bare Mars? Jing Jiu was exhausted after thinking so much. The most dreadful thing was that the sword wheels of the thoughtless sword were attacking inside his body. During the process of calculating, he didn't cough, nor did he faint. In fact, he was in great pain, but nobody was aware of it. Zhao Liu was well aware of it. "Enough," she said, giving no room for refusal. Having said that, she pushed the wheelchair back to the top of the cliff. The group was startled, wondering what was going on. Jing Jiu had finally coughed again. It took him a while to calm down. "I'll leave the rest to you," he said feebly. To whom would he entrust the most troublesome and time-consuming process of checking the calculation? Tong Yin suddenly thought of the green sky mirror carried by Zhao Liu, her eyes beaming a bit, but soon after, she shook her head. Even though Qing controlled the central computer of the Federation of the Milky Way, the Mars couldn't be connected to the outside world at the moment, so she couldn't borrow the power of the central computer. Whom was Jing Jiu talking to then? A buzzing sound broke out by the cliff's edge, like the buzzing of wild bees. A few gazes fell on the snow girl, because they noticed that the butterfly not on her head had moved slightly. She had already turned into an ice sculpture. The group knew that the butterfly knot was the formidable magic bug of the snow girl, and Tong Yin and the others knew that it was Cold Cicada. Cold Cicada flapped its wings softly. Though the group didn't see anything, they sensed that many invisible dots had flown up and landed on the cliff walls. Then, the dots began to rearrange themselves, forming new numbers and symbols. "Can those mosquitoes do calculations besides talking?" asked Zhao Liu in bafflement. "It's the snow girl doing the calculations," said Jingjiu. Zhao Liu thought that the snow girl had to deal with the sword formation of the solar system, and at the same time, she had to divide her attention to perform such complicated calculations. It seemed that Jingjiu had used up all of her energy. Seeing his pale face, Zhao Liu remembered that he had used up all of his energy as well. "Let's sleep for a while," she said regretfully. Jingjiu said, "They have finished most of the basic calculations. I didn't do much, so I'm not tired." Yushan walked to the front of the wheelchair and said to Jingjiu admiringly, "Senior Master, I didn't expect you to be so good at math. I learned it on the battleship, but I thought it was very difficult." Thinking of the time they spent studying in the apartment, Jingjiu said with a faint smile, "I'm not good at math, but I'm better at other aspects." Yushan asked curiously with widened eyes, "What else have you learned, Senior Master?" Thinking of the stories told by Zhong Lizi, Zhao Liu said, "He has learned all of them." Jingjiu was the best mathematician, physicist, chemist, and medical scientist in the Federation of the Milky Way. If he wanted to, he could become the leader of all the subjects. Yet, he hadn't had a chance to apply his knowledge in the last 2 years. In other words, knowledge was indeed useless in the face of force. Jingjiu was unwilling to recall his bad experience in math. Looking at the circular base on the barren land in the distance, he said, "It looks interesting over there. Let's go and have a look." Meow. The bulge of the blanket on Jingjiu's body quivered slightly. Ada came out from inside, stretched his body, and meowed to show his approval. He didn't like the tense atmosphere in the cliffs or the patch of sky that was getting closer and closer. This was the highest peak on Mars, and it was closer to the sky. It was safer for him to go to the ground. It was not until then that the fairy men discovered Ada's existence. Looking at the long-haired white cat lying on Jingjiu's leg, their expressions grew grave. They had all learned of what had happened on the main planet. This was the white ghost, the guardian of Aoyama. He had knocked Cheng Shuang to the deep part of the universe with a swipe of his paw and shattered the huge gravitational field with a stomp of his paw. It was truly formidable. Jingjiu suddenly thought of an important matter because of Ada. He turned to Yuan Shu and asked, "How did you two get out?" Yuan Shu replied honestly. Tong Yin picked up Xin Yunmai and sent a message back. Hearing the beginning, Jingjiu figured out what had happened. He signaled for Jingjiu to stop talking and asked, "Where is the dog?" Now that Tong Yin and Xin Yunmai had contacted Chao Tian and found a way to help Yuan Shu and Yushan ascend successfully, the dead dog had no reason not to leave with them. Jingjiu knew better than anybody else that the dead dog had wanted to leave Chao Tian a long time ago and come to this world to have a look. Yuan Shu said nervously, "The Master Knight Howler is gone to find the center of the formation." "Nonsense," Jingjiu retorted icily. Back when the civil war broke out in Aoyama, Jingjiu and his big brother had made a promise that the chickens and dogs would ascend to heaven. Now that the dead dog had ascended successfully, he went to such a dangerous place. What if something happened to him? It was rare for the disciples to see Jingjiu get angry, so they didn't dare argue with him. Send the space coordinates and the equations of the fluid function you have calculated to the outside, and ask him to come back as soon as possible. Jingjiu calculated the time according to what Yuan Shu had told him. The dead dog had stayed in the sword formation of the solar system for more than 10 days, so he must have been severely wounded. Yuan Shu said uneasily, "I don't know where he is." To broadcast it to the whole solar system. How should we do it? Jingjiu looked at the snow girl by the cliff's edge. The snow girl raised her small, round hand with her back to Jingjio. A clear trace of ice suddenly appeared in the frozen sky, and then more traces appeared. The traces combined and turned into symbols that nobody could recognize. Looking at the sky, Tong Yin realized that those were the opposite symbols. If someone looked at Mars from the solar system, they would be able to see the accurate information. Having ascertained that there was no problem, Jingjio said softly, "Let's go. We won't come back until they find the center of the formation." The sand grains brought up by the tornado were still falling down slowly. It would take 70 hours for the sand grains to fall down completely. What was he doing on the cliff during this period of time? Was he in a daze? Ada meowed incessantly, indicating that they should leave as soon as possible. The rays of light in the transparent ice cube suddenly changed slightly. It was unclear when she had opened her eyes. She said to Jingjio expressionlessly, "In order to set up this sword formation of the solar system, I have allocated 7% of the resources of the Federation of the Milky Way to him, and it has been going on for 170 years. He has spent all his time and energy on it. Do you think he will let you find the center of the formation so easily?" Jingjio turned his head and shot her a glance, saying nothing. Zhao Liu pushed the wheelchair away from the top of the mountain. Tong Yin, Kane Yang, and the others intended to continue breaking the formation. Lu Shui and the others had nothing else to do, so they followed them. They, of course, wanted to be with Jingjio when they met again after so many years. Moreover, the sword formation of the solar system would kill all of them if they couldn't find the center of the formation after the hourglass fell down completely. They had to cherish the last bit of time they had. Su Zai remarked feebly, "Does this mean that we should die together, even if we have to die?" Yuan Chu snapped angrily, "Don't say it if you don't know how to talk, and don't do what Shinyamai did." The faint traces of the wheelchair and the footprints were left on the surface of Mars, leading from Olympus to the northwest barren land. Since they were here to kill time, they walked casually instead of flying. A few years had passed in Chaotian after Zhao Liu and Lu Shui had ascended, so they would talk about the situation there. The most important thing to talk about was who had died, and who had died again. "How are the monkeys doing?" asked Jingjio. Yushan thought that the monkeys of Shinma Peak had passed through many generations, so he didn't know how to respond. Yuan Chu knew that his senior master was asking about the monkeys, but he was actually concerned about someone else. "Big Brother Gu is doing fine, but Empress who might have to leave soon," he said. "Was that Vixen going to die as well?" Lu Shui fell silent. It was unclear if he thought of Xiaohe. Jingjio sighed after a moment of silence when he thought of his nephew. Suzai finally said something appropriate. "Why do you sigh, immortal?" "Nobody calls me master," said Jingjio. When he landed on the cliff, Lu Shui and the others came up to him and bowed to him. Some called him young master, some called him master, some called him senior master, and some called him immortal, but none of them called him master. So many disciples of the younger generation in Chaotian had ascended, but none of them were his disciples. Kane Yang was his disciple, but she was not a disciple of Shinma Peak. Gu Qing was his official senior disciple, but he betrayed his sect and exiled himself on the ocean, and it was unclear when he would be able to ascend. Ping Yongka and Apiao had their own important tasks, so they couldn't leave for the time being. Thinking of this, Jingjio felt it was a bit odd. "If you want me to call you master, I'll do it." Zhao Liu continued expressionlessly. "We had mentioned this back in Scenery Garden. You were lazy, so you said that we should talk about it this way." "How could they talk about it?" Jingjio coughed. His coughing echoed on the surface of Mars for a long time. Yuan Chu shot a glance at Su Zai, indicating that he had seen it and that this was a well-chosen remark. Su Zai wondered if this remark was made by the immortal Liu or the immortal Jingyang. They didn't enter the circular base but went to the rear. The wheelchair was parked on the stone steps. Jingju leaned against it and looked at the traces of the distant ancient civilization buried by the yellow sand in the pit. It was unclear what was on his mind. Then they went to visit other places. The sceneries on Mars were all barren, and there was nothing to see here. No matter how much time they wasted, it wouldn't be a big waste. In the early morning of the third day, they returned to the top of the mountain. The sand was still falling down from the sky. Judging by the amount of sand in the tornado, it would last for a few more hours. Dead dog hasn't come back yet. Zhao Lei knew what Jing Jiao was most concerned about. Qin Yang shook her head. Zhao Lei pressed. What about the eye of the formation? Qin Yang shook her head again, saying with a grave expression, We've encountered two troubles. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.